On the morning of August 20th, 1992, every member of the British royal family sitting at breakfast at Balmoral Castle was poring over copies of the Daily Mirror. Sarah Ferguson was among them. She already knew what was in the paper. She had known the photographs existed. What she hadn't known was how explicit they would be. 26 of them, published that morning, and she was sitting at the same table as the Queen of England, reading her own front page. The Queen's face, according to witnesses, was like stone. Princess Anne, who was also at the table, allegedly wanted to strangle her. The photographs showed Sarah topless, poolside at a villa in St Tropez, with an American man named John Bryan. Bryan was her financial advisor. In one photograph, he was kissing her foot. The tabloids called it toe-sucking. Bryan, 30 years later, still insists it was kissing and not sucking, and also that he is from New York and not Texas, which is the specific thing that has bothered him most about how he is remembered. The two children, Princess Beatrice aged 4, Princess Eugenie aged 2, were visible in some of the photographs. Sarah left Balmoral that day. A servant who was present described her behavior at the breakfast table as the strangest thing he had ever seen. She acted, he said, as if she were the person who had been wronged, as if the photographer and the newspapers were the problem, not her. She did not come back to Sandringham for Christmas for 32 years. Here is what the photographs cost her. The palace stopped paying her bills that week. Her divorce settlement in 1996 was £500,000. Diana's, in the same year, was £17 million. She received no HRH. She lost access to the royal residences. She accumulated debts that eventually reached £5 million, enough that a senior Buckingham Palace financial advisor recommended she file for voluntary bankruptcy, which would have been the first time in the history of the British royal family. She accepted £15,000 from Jeffrey Epstein to pay a staff member she owed money to. She was secretly recorded in 2010, offering access to Prince Andrew for £500,000. She is currently living at Royal Lodge with the man she divorced in 1996. She was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2023 and skin cancer in 2024. In 2025, emails emerged showing the full extent of her Epstein connection. Her publisher dropped her children's book. Her charities dropped her. This is the cost of the photographs. John Bryan filed for bankruptcy in 1996, the same year Sarah and Andrew divorced. He married a 22-year-old Belgian model in 2005. The model later said she paid him a lot of money. They divorced in 2013. When the Crown dramatized the scandal in 2022, Bryan gave his first major interview. He said the whole thing was based on lies. He said, "I don't want to be forever known as Fergie's Texan toe-sucking financial advisor. For starters, I'm from New York. It is 33 years later, and that is still how he is known." This account examines what actually happened, not just the photographs, but the formation that produced the woman who needed a John Bryan, the marriage that created the conditions, the institution that extracted the maximum available punishment, and the specific arithmetic of what one morning at a villa in St Tropez cost a woman who had been the most popular royal in Britain 6 years earlier. If you are enjoying this story so far, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. In July 1986, the British public watched Sarah Ferguson walk up the aisle of Westminster Abbey and decided, collectively and with the specific enthusiasm of the people who have found the person they were waiting for in the specific register of the royal family's social world, that she was exactly what the institution needed. She was 26 years old. She was not Diana, not the composed ice blonde of the fairy tale who had preceded her down the same aisle 5 years earlier. She was something different. She was the red-haired, round-faced, laughing, irreverent, thoroughly unbothered person who was marrying the Queen's second son and who appeared to find the entire occasion enormously entertaining rather than enormously dignified. The British public found this a relief. Diana had been the fairy tale. The fairy tale was beautiful, and it was producing the specific quality of the anxiety that beauty produces in the people who are watching it from the outside, the anxiety of the thing that might break. Sarah was not the fairy tale. Sarah was the person you could imagine having a drink with. She made faces at photographers. She cracked jokes in public. She wore clothes that the fashion critics found too bright and the public found entirely charming. She was the breath of fresh air that the people who use the phrase breath of fresh air deploy it for. The person whose arrival in the stuffy room has been noticed and welcomed in the specific way that the stuffy room welcomes the person who does not perform its stuffiness. The stuffy room was the British royal family. She married Andrew on the 23rd of July 1986 at Westminster Abbey and became the Duchess of York, and the public's approval ratings for her were higher than the Queen's in the weeks after the wedding. Higher than the Queen's. The woman who had been born at Dummerdown Farm in Hampshire in 1959, the daughter of a polo manager and a woman who would eventually leave the family for Argentina, had married the Queen's son and had produced higher approval ratings than the Queen. The formation that produced this person requires the honest examination, because the formation is the thing that the Bryan photographs and the St Tropez villa and the Balmoral breakfast and the 33 years of debt and Epstein and living with her ex-husband were all produced from. And the formation is the thing that the account of the photographs cost consistently fails to examine with the attention that the cost requires. Her father was Major Ronald Ferguson. The Major was the polo manager, initially for Prince Philip and then for the Prince of Wales, which was the specific career position that placed him at the specific intersection of the polo world and the royal world, that produced, as the natural byproduct, the introduction of his daughter to the people whose polo he was managing. The Major knew everyone who mattered in the world of the people who mattered. He was charming, and he was well connected, and he was, by the extensive accounts of the people who knew him, comprehensively unfaithful to every woman he was ever with. In 1988, the Daily Mirror photographed the Major leaving a massage parlor. He was the polo manager for the heir to the throne. His daughter was the Duchess of York. He was photographed leaving a massage parlor. He apologized. He continued being the polo manager. The specific quality of the Major's relationship to his own behavior, the charm and the indiscretion and the apology and the continuation, was the quality that the formation in the household of the Major had produced in the person who had grown up watching it. Her mother was Susan Wright. Susan was the kind of woman who made a specific impression on the people who met her, warm and vivid and present in the specific way that the person whose presence fills the room fills it. She had married Ronald Ferguson in 1956. She had produced two daughters, Jane, born 1953, and Sarah, born 1959. She had lived the life of the polo manager's wife in the specific social world of the polo world and the Hampshire countryside and the people whose world the polo produced, and then she left. When Sarah was 12 years old, some accounts say 13, some accounts say 14, the specific age a matter of the specific account's source, her mother left. Not in the gradual sense of the marriage dissolving, in the literal sense of the specific person who had been the mother, deciding that the life she was living was not the life she was going to continue living, and departing for Argentina with a polo player named Hector Barrantes. The departing was the departing. Her mother flew to South America with the polo player and left the 12-year-old, or 13-year-old, or 14-year-old at Dummerdown Farm with her father. Her sister Jane got married around the same time and moved to Australia. Sarah later described the specific compound of the losses. "My mum upped and left us for Argentina," she said, followed soon after by my sister Jane, who went to Australia, leaving me and my father alone. The alone was the alone of the specific compound, the mother who went to Argentina and the sister who went to Australia, and the 12-year-old left at the Hampshire farm with the polo manager, who was himself managing the specific wounds of the wife, who had left him with the same mechanisms that the polo manager used for everything, which were the charm and the indiscretion and the subsequent women. She developed an eating disorder at 12. She said so herself. The overeating for comfort. The specific comfort of the person who has identified in the food the available management of the feelings that the available world has declined to manage in the form of the mother who stayed, and the sister who stayed, and the father whose management of his own losses was the management of the person who is not in a position to manage someone else's. She overeated for comfort. The comfort was the available comfort. The royal biographer Ingrid Seward said, "In the assessment, that the account of Sarah Ferguson's life has preserved as the most precisely accurate available assessment. I think because her mother left, there is a sort of basic something missing there. There is something missing in her personality. She's so insecure, which is probably at the root of many of her behaviors. Sarah agreed with this assessment in the form of the self-examination that the memoir and the interviews had produced across the years. She called the abandonment profound. She called it one of the toughest times of her life. She said the themes of abandonment in her work stemmed from her own experience. The something missing was the something that Sarah herself had identified and named. The something missing organized the subsequent decades. It organized the need for the approval, and the crowd, and the laughter, and the irreverence, and the faces at the photographers, and the weight, and the overeating, and the men who were not the right men, and the money that was never enough, and the spending that was always too much, and the friendships that were always too generous, and the borders that were always too porous, and the specific quality of the person who does not know where she ends, and the available world begins, because the person who was supposed to teach her the boundary went to Argentina when she was 12. Andrew fit the pattern. Not because Andrew was emotionally unavailable, though he was, spectacularly, for reasons the Royal Navy and his own specific formation had produced in him, but because Andrew was the person whose love was the love of the person who was frequently elsewhere, which was the love that the 12-year-old's formation had organized around as the available form of the love. The love that is elsewhere is the love you learned from the mother who went to Argentina. You know how to love it, you know how to need it, you do not know how to require it to be present. She had met Andrew when they were children. Their fathers were connected through the polo world. They had known each other in the specific way that the children of the connected social world know each other. The presence at the same occasions, the familiarity of the same world, the person who was always there in the background of the available social occasions. Then Diana had married Charles in 1981, and Sarah had been Diana's friend, genuinely, warmly, in the specific way that Diana's friendship was genuine and warm, and Diana had introduced Sarah to Andrew at Royal Ascot in 1985, in the form of the reintroduction that the people who have known each other distantly, and who are now in the same immediate social world, produce as the specific occasion for the closer contact. They started a relationship. The engagement was announced in March 1986. The wedding was July. The approval ratings were through the roof. The breath of fresh air was in the stuffy room. What the stuffy room was actually like from the inside is the thing that the approval ratings had not required the assessment of before the wedding, and that the subsequent years provided with the specific detail that the inside of the stuffy room provides to the person who has moved into it with the formation of the 12-year-old who was left at Dummer Down Farm. The palace was not a home. It was the institution. The institution had the protocol and the schedule and the specific requirements of the person who was the wife of the Queen's second son, and who was therefore the person whose daily life was the daily life of the institutional requirement, rather than the daily life of the person whose formation had been the formation of the Hampshire farm and the polo world and the overeating for comfort. She said, "I married my man, who happened to be a prince and a naval officer, but what I got was not the man, I got the palace and didn't get him. For our marriage, I saw him 40 days a year, 40 days. She was the Duchess of York, and she was in the palace, and she saw her husband 40 days a year, and she had the something missing, and she had the formation of the 12-year-old who was left, and she had the approval ratings that were higher than the Queen's, and she had the breath of fresh air coverage, and she was completely alone inside all of it. Something was going to give. The something that gave was the specific sequence of events that St Tropez and John Bryan and August 20th, 1992, eventually produced. But the sequence's beginning was not St Tropez. The sequence's beginning was Argentina. It was always Argentina. The house they were given was called Sunninghill Park. It was a newly built property on the Windsor estate, completed in 1990, 4 years into the marriage. The public had nicknamed it South Fork, after the television series Dallas, because the house was large and modern and tasteless in the specific way that the large and modern and newly built house of the early 1990s is tasteless. The wrong materials and the wrong proportions and the specific quality of the expensive that is not the same thing as the refined. The press mocked it. The public mocked it. The royal family was quietly appalled by it. Sarah had been involved in the design. The involvement in the design had produced South Fork. The involvement in the design of South Fork was the involvement of the person who had the something missing, and who was spending the something missing into the available space, in the form of the house, that was large enough and expensive enough to fill the available space, for as long as the filling was the available activity. The filling was always the available activity for Sarah Ferguson. The filling had been the overeating for comfort since the 12-year-old at Dummerdown Farm. In the marriage, the filling took the additional forms of the spending, and the staff, and the travel, and the engagements, and the social world, and the specific variety of the activity that the person who does not know how to be still deploys when the person is not in a position to be still. She had, by the accounts of the people who observed the household's operation, 5 times more personal servants than Princess Diana. 5 times. Diana, who was the most famous woman in the world, and who was managing the most scrutinized existence available in the British public life, had a personal staff at a specific level. Sarah had 5 times that level. The surplus was not the surplus of the institutional requirement. It was the surplus of the person for whom the management of the available people was the available management of the available something. The spending on travel was the spending that the accounts of the period have documented in the specific form of the excess baggage. She would arrive at airports, by the accounts preserved in the biographical record, with 25 cases. 25, and would pay between £800 and £4,000 in excess baggage charges, routinely, as the standard cost of the movement between the available occasions. She brought trunks solely for coat hangers. The coat hangers required their own trunk. The trunk containing the coat hangers travelled with the 25 cases, and the personal trainers, and the hairdressers, and the Pilates instructors, who were paid hundreds of pounds an hour to wait for her to emerge from her room in the late afternoon. Jenny Bond, the former BBC royal correspondent who covered the Yorks' marriage from the inside of the institutional world that the marriage was being conducted inside, said, "I've always thought her downfall was her hopeless grasp of money, combined with her desire to have more and more of it. She allowed her debts to spiral on a level few of us would understand. The debts began immediately, not in the sense of the gradual accumulation of the person who is living slightly beyond their means, in the sense of the specific acceleration of the person for whom the available income was the floor rather than the ceiling, and who was organizing the spending around the ceiling rather than the floor. The available income was the income that the royal household's provision for the wife of the Queen's second son provided, which was the provision of the institutional position rather than the provision of the commercial income of the person whose commercial income the institution provided the alternative to. The alternative was the institutional provision. The institutional provision was not the ceiling that the spending required. She had wanted to work. This is the dimension of the marriage's interior that the spending and the staff and the 25 cases and the coat hanger trunks have consistently obscured, the specific wanting of the person who was formed in the Polo World and the Hampshire Farm, and who had worked before the marriage in the publishing industry in London, and who had found in the working the available engagement with the available world that the working provides to the person whose formation has produced the specific energy of the person who needs to do, rather than simply be. The palace did not want her to work. The Duchess of York was the Duchess of York. The Duchess of York did not work in the commercial sense of the person whose commercial engagement with the available world was the engagement of the Duchess rather than the person. The institutional position required the institutional presence rather than the commercial engagement. The institutional presence was the appearances and the engagements and the charities and the specific variety of the visible that the Duchess's institutional position generated as the available visible. She was not suited to the visible without the doing. The visible without the doing was the visible of the person who is present at the occasions, whose function is the presence rather than the action, and the formation of the 12-year-old who had been left, and who had been filling the available space with the available activity, since the leaving did not produce the person who was suited to the presence without the action. Andrew was not there. This is the specific biographical fact of the marriage's interior that everything else requires to be understood in the context of. He was in the Navy. He had been in the Navy since before the marriage. He was not in the Navy in the sense of the person whose naval duties required the occasional absence. He was in the Navy in the sense of the person whose naval career was the career and whose marriage was the other thing that he was also doing alongside the career. The 40 days a year that Sarah eventually described was the 40 days a year of the person who is the wife of the career's husband, rather than the husband of the marriage's wife. The 40 days a year was not entirely Andrew's production. He had chosen the naval career, and he had chosen to maintain it after the marriage in the specific form of the person who did not regard the marriage as the reason to alter the career's requirements. But the institution had also chosen the naval career as the appropriate career for the Queen's second son, and the choosing was the institutional choosing that Andrew's own formation inside the institution had produced as the available choice for the person in his position. The institution had produced a husband who was absent. The formation had produced a wife who could not tolerate the absence. The combination was the combination that the marriage was. The affairs were not one-sided. This is the biographical fact that the account of the Bryan photographs and their specific cost consistently omits, because the omitting serves the specific narrative that the account has been organizing around the photographs and what they cost Sarah. The affairs were not one-sided. Andrew's own conduct in the marriage's early years has been described by the available sources in the terms of the person who was conducting himself in the specific way that the entitled man of the institutional world of the British Armed Forces of the 1980s conducts himself when he is frequently away from home and surrounded by the specific social world of the naval officers' postings. He slept with, by the accounts of the period that the biographers have assembled from the available sources, more than a dozen women in the first year of the marriage alone. The more than a dozen women in the first year alone is the biographical fact that the public account of the marriage has not organized itself around in the specific way that the toe-sucking photographs have organized themselves around the public account of the marriage. The 12 women in the first year were the private account. The photographs were the public one. The asymmetry of the public and the private accounts is the asymmetry of the institution's management of the available information about the marriage's interior, the private account remaining private and the public account being the account of the woman's specific failing rather than the marriage's shared failure. Steve Wyatt was the beginning of Sarah's specific failings. Steve Wyatt was a Texas oil millionaire whose social world was the social world of the international wealthy class of the late 1980s and early 1990s. The world of the private jets and the luxury properties and the polo connections that had placed him in the specific social orbit of the people whose polo connections overlapped with the royal family's polo connections. He had met Sarah through the polo world. He had been introduced, variously, as a friend and a family friend and the son of Oscar Wyatt, a Texas oil billionaire whose commercial interests and social connections had produced the specific variety of the wealthy American whose social world overlapped with the British aristocracy's social world in the form of the polo and the racing and the specific occasions of the wealthy Anglo-American overlap. Sarah fell for Wyatt in 1989. This was 3 years into the marriage. Beatrice had been born in August 1988. The falling for Wyatt was the falling of the person whose formation had organized the love around the person who was elsewhere, and whose marriage had produced the person who was elsewhere, in the form of the naval career and the 40 days a year. Wyatt was present. Wyatt paid attention. Wyatt was the available attention of the person who was not the institutional husband, performing the institutional presence at the 40 available annual days. The relationship produced the photographs. Not the Bryan photographs, those came later. The Wyatt photographs. In January 1992, photographs emerged of Sarah and Steve Wyatt on holiday together in Morocco. The photographs showed them on holiday in a manner that the photographs of the separated holiday produce, the intimacy of the two people who are sharing the specific domestic space of the holiday and who are photographed in the specific way that the intimate holiday photographs the people on the holiday. Critically, Princess Beatrice was in some of the photographs. The 3-year-old daughter of the Duchess of York was in the holiday photographs of the Duchess of York and the Texas oil millionaire. The presence of Beatrice in the photographs was the specific detail that the palace received as the specific detail that required the institutional response. The grandchild of the Queen in the holiday photographs of the Duchess, and the man the Duchess was not married to. The Queen ordered Sarah to cut all contact with Wyatt immediately. The ordering was the ordering of the institution's head, who had received the photographs, and who had assessed the photographs, and who had concluded that the contact required the cutting. Sarah visited Wyatt's apartment on 2 further occasions after the order. The further visits were the defiance, the specific act of the person who has received the institutional instruction and who has decided that the institutional instruction is the instruction that the formation of the something missing requires to be defied in the form of the continued availability of the person whose attention was the attention that the something missing needed. The palace received the defiance. The palace characterized it by the accounts of the palace insiders who described it afterward as the breakdown of trust, an interpretation as a direct act of defiance against the Queen's authority rather than a private lapse in judgment. The separation was announced on the 19th of March 1992. Sarah and Andrew had agreed to separate in January 1992. The separation was the specific institutional management of the available options, when the available options had been reduced to the separation by the specific combination of the Wyatt photographs and the palace's assessment of the marriage's continuation. She was separated. She was not divorced. She was the Duchess of York, who was separated from the Duke of York. She was in the palace's social world as the separated rather than the divorced. She was managing the something missing in the specific condition of the woman who is separated and who has the children, and who is managing the children, and who has the formation of the 12-year-old who was left, and who is now 32 years old, and who has been left again, in the specific form of the institution that had not wanted her in the form she came in. John Bryan was in her social world. He had come to her through the Wyatt connection, through the overlapping social world of the international wealthy class, and the polo connections, and the specific people who were in the social world that Wyatt's presence had generated around Sarah's available social world. He was described as her financial advisor. The description was the description of the available relationship in the available institutional form, the financial advisor, rather than the man who was in her life, in the specific form of the person who was paying the attention that the something missing required. He was paying the attention. She was separated. The villa in St Tropez was the available summer. The summer's photographs were 5 months away. John Bryan was not from Texas. He has been saying this for 33 years. He has said it in every interview he has given since August 1992, which is not a large number of interviews, but is a consistent number of corrections. He is from New York. He grew up in New York. He has never lived in Texas in any meaningful residential sense. The Texas characterization attached itself to him in the initial coverage of the photographs because the American wealthy man in the British tabloids' vocabulary of the American wealthy man is the Texas oil millionaire rather than the New York financier, and the vocabulary had applied the Texas to the American whose presence in the photographs required a shorthand, and the shorthand was Texas. He is not from Texas. The correction is the correction that has followed him more persistently than the photographs. He said in his 2022 interview, when the Crown's 5th season dramatized the scandal and sent his phone ringing with friends calling to tell him he was in the show, "I don't want to be forever known as Fergie's Texan toe-sucking financial advisor. For starters, I'm from New York." The toe-sucking is the second correction. He says that did not happen either. He says the photograph that was characterized as the toe-sucking photograph was the photograph of him kissing or holding her foot in the specific affectionate form that the person who is lying by a pool in the south of France in the summer with someone they care about deploys in the specific register of the poolside affection. He says the characterization as sucking was the tabloid's production rather than the photograph's content. He says the photograph's content was innocent. The tabloids had 33 years to develop the toe-sucking characterization. Bryan has had 33 years to correct it. The tabloid's version is the version that is in the public record in the form that 33 years of the public record's repetition produces. Bryan's correction is the correction that is also in the public record, in the form that the correction of the 33-year-old tabloid characterization produces, which is the form of the correction that is noted and returned to the 33-year-old characterization in the sentence after the noting. He said in 2022, "My phone has been ringing off the hook with friends calling to tell me I'm in the Crown." In a weird way, it's a great honor to be in the show, but if you go back 30 years, it's all based on lies. It's more serious. That's where the lies started. The lies that started 30 years ago are the characterizations that the coverage had produced. The Texas, the toe-sucking, the sinister financial advisor. The characterizations are the characterizations that John Bryan has been unable to correct for 30 years, because the characterizations are the characterizations of the tabloid photograph, and the tabloid photograph is the characterization that the tabloid's visual vocabulary has made permanent in the form that the visual vocabulary makes the characterization permanent. He was 37 years old when the photographs were taken. He had been in Sarah's life for approximately 2 years before the St Tropez villa. The 2 years were the 2 years of the relationship that had grown from the Wyatt connection, from the overlapping social world of the international wealthy class, whose polo connections and business connections and social occasions had placed Bryan in the specific orbit of the people whose orbit Sarah inhabited in the years following the Wyatt relationship. The financial advisor designation was the designation of the person whose function in Sarah's life was the function that the available institutional designation permitted to be the designation, without requiring the elaboration of the actual relationship that the designation was covering. The financial advisor was the title. The actual relationship was the relationship of the person who was in Sarah's life, in the form of the man who paid the attention that the something missing required, which was the form that was more than the financial advisory and less than the publicly acknowledged. Bryan was intelligent. He was, by the accounts of the people who knew him in the period of his association with Sarah, a smooth operator in the specific sense of the person who moves through the available social world with the ease of someone who has identified the available movements and who is making them with the specific competence of the identified movement. He was charming in the specific way that the person whose charm is the instrument of the social navigation is charming, the charm that serves the navigation rather than the charm that is simply the character's available quality. He was also, by 1992, managing a financial situation that was not the financial situation of the person whose financial advice to the Duchess of York was the advice of the financially secure. The full picture of Bryan's financial position in 1992 was not the picture that the public account of the financial advisor had been presenting, which was the picture of the wealthy American businessman whose commercial success had produced the specific variety of the wealthy American's available social world. The picture was more complicated than the picture the designation had been producing. By 1996, the year of the divorce, and the year that the St Tropez photographs had been in the public record for 4 years, Bryan filed for bankruptcy. He had failed to pay tens of thousands in debt to creditors in the specific financial collapse of the person whose commercial position had been the commercial position that the 1992 St Tropez presentation had not been entirely accurate about. The financial advisor to the Duchess of York filed for bankruptcy in the same year that the Duchess of York's divorce settlement was the £500,000 that the institution had assessed as the appropriate settlement for the woman the financial advisor had been advising. The specific irony of the financial advisor's bankruptcy in the same year as the advised party's £500,000 settlement is the specific irony that the account of the relationship has preserved as the detail that the account produces when the available details are the details of the financial advisor and the advised and the specific financial outcomes of both in the year of the divorce. The villa was in St Tropez in the south of France. It was the summer holiday of the separated Duchess and her financial advisor and the 2 children, Beatrice, who was 3 years old, and Eugenie, who was almost 2, in the specific form of the family holiday of the separated parent, whose separated parent's summer holiday includes the children, and the person whose presence in the separated parent's life is the presence that the separated parent has organized the summer holiday around. The arrangements for the holiday were not the arrangements of the person who had assessed the available risks of the holiday's specific character and who had concluded that the risk management of the holiday required the specific precautions that the risk required. They were the arrangements of the person who was managing the available summer in the form that the available summer offered, and who had not fully assessed what the available summer's form would produce, when the available summer was the summer of the separated Duchess of York, holidaying in St Tropez with her financial advisor and her 2 small children. The paparazzo was Italian. His name was Daniel Angeli. He had identified the villa and the occupants of the villa and had positioned himself on the hillside above the villa with the telephoto lens that the positioning on the hillside, with the specific geography of the hillside above the villa, required to produce the photographs that the positioning and the telephoto lens produced. The telephoto lens is the instrument of the paparazzo, whose subject is the subject who is not in the public space, but in the private space of the villa, whose geography makes the private space available to the hillside position with the telephoto lens. He produced 26 photographs. The 26 photographs documented the specific available content of the villa's poolside in the specific period of the documentation. The topless duchess, the kissing and the cuddling, and the specific poolside affection of the 2 people who are on holiday and who do not know that the hillside above the villa contains the Italian paparazzo with the telephoto lens. The children were present in some of the photographs in the specific form that the children who are playing near the pool while the adults are by the pool are present in the photographs of the adults by the pool. Bryan's lawyers attempted to prevent publication. The attempt was the attempt of the lawyers who have identified the available legal mechanisms for the prevention of the publication of the photographs that the client does not want published, and who have deployed the available legal mechanisms in the specific jurisdiction of the legal intervention, Paris, where the photographs had been acquired, and London, where the Daily Mirror intended to publish. The Paris intervention failed. The London intervention failed. The court in London produced the specific ruling that the 1992 British legal framework produced, when the available legal framework was the framework that applied to the photographs. There was no reason to block publication, since Britain has no privacy law that would apply. The privacy law that would have applied was the privacy law that Britain did not have. The photographs were publishable because the law that would have prevented the publication was the law that did not exist. The Daily Mirror paid a reported £60,000 for the photographs. The £60,000 was the Daily Mirror's assessment of the commercial value of 26 photographs of the Duchess of York, topless with her financial advisor's mouth on her foot, by a pool in St Tropez in August 1992. The assessment was the assessment of the newspaper whose commercial model was organized around the photographs that the commercial model identified as the photographs whose commercial value exceeded the £60,000 of the acquisition cost. The acquisition cost was £60,000. The subsequent cost to the person in the photographs is the account that this account is assembling. The Mirror published on August 20, 1992. The framing of the publication was the framing that the newspaper, whose editorial line had characterized the Ferguson photographs as the exposure of what it called lies, humbug, and hypocrisy, deployed for the publication that the editorial line was framing as the exposure. The lies and the humbug and the hypocrisy were the lies and the humbug and the hypocrisy of the presentation of the financial advisor as the financial advisor when the financial advisor was the person in the photographs. Sarah was at Balmoral. She was with the royal family. The Daily Record, which is the Scottish version of the Mirror, had the photographs on the front page. Every member of the royal family at Balmoral that morning was poring over copies of it. She was among them. She had known the photographs existed. What she had not known was how explicit they were going to be. The explicit was the 26 photographs of the content that the telephoto lens from the hillside had produced, and that Bryan's lawyers had failed to prevent being published, and that the Mirror had paid £60,000 to publish, and that were now on the front page of the newspaper, that the entire royal family was reading at the Balmoral breakfast table on the morning of August 20, 1992. The Queen's face was like stone. Princess Anne wanted to strangle her. A servant present described Sarah's demeanor as the strangest thing. She appeared, the servant said, to believe she was the person who had been wronged. as if only the photographer and the newspaper editors had behaved badly. John Bryan was in New York. He was not from Texas. The photographs were in the paper. The morning was the morning that everything changed. The Balmoral breakfast was at its usual time. The royal family's summer routine at Balmoral was the routine that the sovereign's annual Scottish retreat had organized across the decades of the annual retreat. The specific rhythms of the Balmoral schedule, the meals at the scheduled times, the specific quality of the institutional life conducting itself in the available form of the domestic, even as the institution continued operating in the form of the institution. On the morning of August 20th, 1992, the specific rhythm of the Balmoral breakfast produced the specific occasion of the entire royal family, or the members of it who were at Balmoral that morning, sitting together at the table at which the morning's newspapers were available, in the specific form that the newspapers are available at the breakfast tables of the houses, whose scale and whose institutional character produces the newspapers as the standard available morning material. The newspaper that morning was the Daily Record. The Daily Record is the Scottish edition of the Daily Mirror, the Edinburgh-produced version of the London tabloid that adapted its content for the Scottish readership in the specific form that the Scottish readership required. The Daily Record had the photographs on the front page in the specific form that the Daily Mirror's front page had them. The 26 photographs of the Duchess of York, topless at the St Tropez villa, with the financial advisor's mouth at her foot. Every member of the royal family at Balmoral that morning was poring over half a dozen copies of the Daily Record at the breakfast table. Sarah was among them, the journalist James Whittaker, who covered the royal family for the Daily Mirror for decades, and who wrote the 1993 book Diana vs. Charles, that provided the most detailed available account of that specific morning, described the scene with the specific authority of the journalist who had assembled it from the accounts of the people who were there. Every member of the family was at the table. Half a dozen copies of the paper were being shared. The photographs were the photographs that the family was looking at. Sarah was at the table looking at the photographs of herself. She had known the photographs existed. This is the biographical detail that the available accounts of the morning have established as the detail that distinguishes the quality of the experience from the experience it might otherwise have been. She had known. Bryan had known. Bryan's lawyers had tried to stop the publication and had failed, and the failing had produced the knowledge in Sarah and Bryan that the publication was going to occur, and that the publication was going to be the publication of the photographs that the telephoto lens had produced. What Sarah had not known was how explicit the published form would be. The how explicit of the published form was the specific surprise of the morning, not the existence of the photographs, but the scale of the content that the publication had deployed. The scale of the content was the 26 photographs, in the specific form of the topless, and the kissing, and the poolside intimacy, and John Bryan lying on top of the Duchess by the pool, and the children in the background, and the specific accumulation of the content that the 26 photographs produced in the person who was now sitting at the Balmoral breakfast table, looking at the version of herself that the 26 photographs had produced. The Queen's face was like stone. This is the specific physical description of the Queen's reaction that the accounts of the morning have preserved in the form of the description that the witness of the face produces when the face is the face of the most controlled available person in the available institutional world, managing the response to the most uncontrollable available thing that the available institutional world had produced for the management that morning. Like stone, the Queen's face like stone was the Queen's face in the specific form of the complete management of the available reaction, the complete management of the person who has learned across 70 years of the formation in the family of the sovereign to produce the managed face as the available response to the unmanageable situation. Princess Anne wanted to strangle her. This is the account produced by the royal biographer Andrew Lowney, whose research into the period has established the specific quality of Princess Anne's reaction in the terms that the research into the reactions of the people who were at the Balmoral breakfast table has produced. Anne had little tolerance for explanations or justifications, the account has established. She felt Sarah's behavior had plunged the wider family into unnecessary turmoil and embarrassment, and she did not hesitate to make her anger and disapproval unmistakably clear to those around her. The unmistakably clear anger of Princess Anne is the anger of the person whose relationship to the institution is the relationship of the person who has organized her life around the institution's requirements and who has produced, from the organizing of the life around the institution's requirements, the specific quality of the person for whom the violation of those requirements by another member of the institution is the violation that produces the specific variety of the anger that the violation of the thing you have organized your life around produces. Anne had organized her life around the institution. Sarah had violated the institution. The anger was the anger of the organized life confronting the violation. The servant who was present at Balmoral during the episode provided the specific account of Sarah's behavior that has been preserved in the accounts of the morning as the account that establishes the most specifically disturbing dimension of Sarah's response to the situation. The servant described Sarah's demeanor as strange in the specific way. The way, the servant said, of the person who believed she was the person who had been wronged. As if, the servant said, she had every right to go on holiday with another man, kiss and cuddle him, and the only people who had behaved wrongly were the photographer and the editors of the newspapers who had published the photographs. The person who believes they are the person who has been wronged when the wrong they are managing is the wrong of the 26 photographs of themselves at the St Tropez villa, is the person whose relationship to the responsibility for the 26 photographs is the relationship of the person whose formation has not equipped them to assume the responsibility in the form that the responsibility requires. The formation was the formation of the something missing. The something missing organized the responsibility in the direction of the photographer and the editors, rather than the direction of the villa and the poolside and the financial advisor. The Queen's reaction was the managed stone face at the breakfast table. Andrew's reaction was a different kind of management. Andrew was at Balmoral. Andrew had also seen the photographs. Andrew was the separated husband whose wife was at his family's breakfast table, having seen photographs of his wife's feet in the mouth of her financial advisor published in the newspaper that his entire family was reading at the breakfast table. Andrew's reaction was protective, not protective in the sense of the husband defending the wife against the institution's reaction. He was not positioned to make that defense in the specific circumstances of the breakfast table and the photographs and the stone face of his mother. Protective in the sense of the person who understood that Sarah was the person who needed the protection of the available protection, and who was going to provide it, in whatever available form the institution's management of the situation permitted. He wanted her to stay. He managed the available options in the direction of her staying at Balmoral after the breakfast table. She stayed. She did not leave Balmoral on the morning of August 20th. She stayed for 5 days. The 5 days at Balmoral after the photographs were the 5 days that the available accounts of the period have documented as the 5 days of the specific quality of the person who is staying in the place where the institution's reaction to what she has produced is the reaction of the stone face and the strangle, and the servant's assessment of the strange demeanor. She stayed for 5 days. She was at the family's table. She was in the family's presence. The family's presence was the presence of the stone face and the strangle and the photographs on the front page of the newspaper. Prince Philip was enraged. The enraged was the enraged of Philip's specific character in the specific situation, the specific anger of the man who had organized his relationship to the institution across the decades of the institutional service, and who had received the photographs as the specific insult to the institution that the photographs represented. Philip had not been a passive presence in the institution's management of its members' personal conduct. He had been the specific voice of the institutional standard in the private family world, the person who had maintained the standard in the family's private world in the specific form of the person who did not tolerate the violation of the standard. He forbade Sarah from entering any royal residences. The forbidding was Philip's forbidding, the specific institutional response of the person who had identified the person who had violated the standard and who was deploying the available institutional response in the form of the prohibition. The prohibition was the prohibition from the royal residences, the specific institutional form of the exclusion that the available institutional form permitted without requiring the formal institutional announcement of the exclusion. Andrew defied Philip. He secretly arranged, through the Queen rather than through Philip, who was not the route that the defiance required to be organized through. for Sarah and the children to visit Balmoral for a weekend while Philip was absent. The arrangement was the arrangement of the son, who was making the available institutional negotiation on behalf of the woman he was separated from, and whose exclusion from the royal residences he was not prepared to accept in the specific form of the complete compliance with the father's forbidding. The Queen permitted the arrangement. She allowed the visit to be organized. Andrew arranged the visit. Sarah came to Balmoral with the children, while Philip was absent. The visit was the visit that the son had organized through the mother rather than the father, and the organizing through the mother rather than the father was the specific quality of the institutional navigation that the family's internal politics required, when the father's position was the forbidding and the mother's position was the permission. 5 days after the photographs had appeared, Sarah left Balmoral. She left with the children and the nanny. The leaving was not the leaving of the person who has been formally expelled. It was the leaving of the person who has been at the breakfast table for 5 days, and who has understood, from the 5 days, the specific quality of the available future at the Balmoral breakfast table, and who has concluded that the available future requires a different arrangement from the available arrangement of the Balmoral breakfast table. The leaving was the leaving that would produce the 33 years. She did not come back to Sandringham for Christmas for 32 of those years. The first Sandringham Christmas she was invited to after the photographs was Christmas 2023, 31 years later. She walked from the estate to St Mary Magdalene Church as part of the Christmas tradition for the first time since 1991. It was the symbolic re-invitation to the family occasion that the family had been declining to extend for 31 years. 31 years between the Balmoral morning and the Sandringham Christmas invitation. The morning had produced the 31 years in the specific form of the stone face, and the strangle, and the 5 days, and the leaving with the children and the nanny. The morning was the morning that everything that followed was produced from. The photographs were the photographs. The morning was the morning. The 31 years were the cost. Lord Charteris was the Queen's former private secretary. He had served as the Queen's private secretary from 1972 to 1977, which was the specific period of the senior institutional role that places the private secretary in the position of the person who is closer to the sovereign's daily institutional life than almost any other available person. The person who manages the correspondence and the schedule and the specific administrative dimension of the sovereign's function in the form that the function requires the person closest to the function to manage. He was the person who said vulgar, vulgar, vulgar. The vulgar, vulgar, vulgar was preserved in the book Fergie, Her Secret Life, which assembled the specific institutional reactions to the photographs from the accounts of the people inside the institution who had produced those reactions in the private form that the institution's internal social world circulates its reactions in. The vulgar, vulgar, vulgar was Charteris's specific 3-word assessment of Sarah Ferguson, delivered to the people in his immediate vicinity after the photographs had been the photographs that the Balmoral breakfast table had pored over. 3 words, 3 repetitions of the same word. The repetition is the specific form of the devastating assessment that the devastated person produces when the single word is insufficient, and the 3 repetitions of the word produce the specific accumulation of the devastation that the single word cannot contain. Vulgar, vulgar, vulgar. The palace stopped paying her bills, not immediately, not in the specific form of the same-day termination of the financial support, but in the specific period following the photographs. The institution's management of the financial relationship between the institution and the Duchess of York was the management that produced the termination of the financial provision that the institution had been providing in the form of the institutional support for the Duchess's position. The statement that the palace eventually released was the statement that said they would cease covering her expenses. The ceasing of the covering of the expenses was the specific institutional punishment in the financial form. The punishment of the withdrawal of the available institutional resource in the form of the financial resource that the institutional position had been generating and that the institutional position was now declining to generate in the form of the continued provision. The withdrawal of the financial provision was the punishment in the most practical available form. The money stopped. This was the punishment of the person who had been spending, at the level of the 25 cases, and the coat-hanger trunks, and the 5 times Diana's servants, and the personal trainers, waiting hundreds of pounds an hour, in the late afternoon. The spending was the spending of the person whose available resource had been the institutional provision, and whose spending had organized itself around the ceiling rather than the floor of the institutional provision. The punishment of the withdrawal of the institutional provision was the punishment of the person whose spending had organized itself around the ceiling, the immediate collapse of the available ceiling onto the available floor. The book Fergie, Her Secret Life, contained the specific account of the John Bryan relationship that the available public account of the photographs had not contained. The account of the relationship as it had operated not only at the St Tropez villa but at Sunninghill Park, the South Fork house on the Windsor estate that had been the Yorks' marital home. The book stated that when John Bryan came to stay at Sunninghill, he and Sarah would indulge in sexual acts in Andrew's study after the prince had gone to bed. Andrew's study. After Andrew had gone to bed. Andrew was asleep upstairs. Sarah and Bryan were in Andrew's study. Senior palace figures were appalled by the behavior. The appalled was the specific reaction of the senior palace figures who had assembled the picture of the relationship's specific character from the available accounts, and who had produced the appalled in the form that the senior palace figures' reaction to the specific content of the study and Andrew upstairs takes. The appalled was available in the form of the available institutional reaction to the specific content. Sarah, the book records, didn't care. She didn't care about the study, or the Andrew upstairs, or the senior palace figures assembled appalled. The not caring was the not caring of the person whose formation had produced the specific relationship to the institutional requirement as the requirement that the formation had not been producing the compliance for, in the specific ways that the study and Andrew upstairs required the compliance for. The public reaction to the photographs was the public reaction that the 1992 British tabloid Landscape produced when the photographs of the Duchess of York, topless, with her financial advisor's mouth at her foot, were the photographs that the front pages were printing. The reaction had a split quality, the mockery and the sympathy existing alongside each other in the specific way that the public reaction to the prominent person's humiliation exists alongside the public reaction to the prominent person's humanity. The mockery was substantial. The tabloids that had not published the photographs produced the coverage of the photographs that the tabloids who have not produced the story produce, when the tabloid who has produced the story has produced the 26 photographs, the commentary and the analysis and the specific variety of the pile-on that the story produces in the tabloid landscape, when the story is the story of the 26 photographs and the Balmoral breakfast table. The Duchess of Pork was one of the nicknames that the tabloid coverage had been deploying for Sarah since the early years of the marriage. The specific variety of the cruelty that the tabloid deploys when the target of the coverage is the woman whose weight has been the weight that the tabloid's specific vocabulary for the prominent woman's weight deploys as the available instrument. Fat Fergie was another. The photographs provided the additional instrument of the toe-sucking to the available instruments of the fat and the pork. The sympathy was also present. The separation had been announced in March 1992. She was separated. She was the separated woman on holiday with her children and the man who was paying her attention. The sympathy of the people who understood the separated woman's situation was the sympathy of the people who had been the separated woman, or who had known the separated woman, or who understood the specific condition of the separated woman whose husband had been away for 40 days a year, and who had the something missing, and who was on holiday in St Tropez. The sympathy did not save her from the institutional punishment. The institutional punishment was not organized around the sympathy of the general public. It was organized around the stone face, and the strangle, and the vulgar, and the palace expenses terminated, and the Philip forbidding, and the Andrews study account, and the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation. Diana's reaction was the reaction of the friend. Diana and Sarah had been close, genuinely, warmly, in the specific quality of the friendship that the two women had formed in the years before the marriages, and that the marriages had maintained, in the specific context of the two women who were navigating the same institution from different positions within it. Diana had been the heir's wife. Sarah had been the second son's wife. They had been the two women in the institution whose friendship was the friendship of the people who were managing the same available world from the available positions. The friendship's specific quality in August 1992 is described in the accounts of the period in the terms of the person who has been the friend and who is now managing the friend's specific crisis from the position of a person who has her own specific crisis. Diana had produced the Morton book in June 1992. The Morton book had been the Morton book. Diana was managing the Morton book's aftermath. Sarah was managing the photograph's mourning. Both were managing the same institution's management of both of them in the year that would become the annus horribilis. Diana's sympathy for Sarah in August 1992 was real, and it was also complicated by the specific dimension of the sympathy of the person who is managing her own crisis, and whose sympathy for the friend is the sympathy of the person who understands the crisis from the inside rather than the outside. Diana understood the institution from the inside. Diana's sympathy was therefore the sympathy that understands rather than merely commiserates. The friendship had already been under strain. The palace had been managing the two women's friendship in the direction of the separation. The specific institutional management of the two wives whose individual situations had been producing the individual institutional crises, and whose friendship had been complicating the institutional management of the two individual crises. The strain had been producing the specific distance between the two friends that the institutional management of the available distance produces in the friendship of the people the institution is separating. After the photographs, the friendship continued in the available form of the friend who understands and who is simultaneously managing her own version of the same institution's management. The understanding and the simultaneous management of the own version produced the friendship in the specific form it could take in August 1992. What the photographs had actually established in the institutional accounting of the available damages was the specific hierarchy of the two women's institutional futures. Diana had the Morton book and the Panorama interview still ahead of her. She had the settlement of £17 million ahead of her. She had the death in Paris ahead of her, and the flowers outside Kensington Palace, and the 30 million people watching the funeral. Sarah had the 5 days at Balmoral, and the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation ahead of her, and the £500,000 settlement, and the Jeffrey Epstein money, and the 2010 sting, and the bankruptcy advice, and the breast cancer, and the skin cancer, and the publishers dropping the children's book. Both women's institutional futures were established in 1992. Both were established by the photographs, Diana's future by the Morton book, and Sarah's future by the Bryan photographs. The specific asymmetry of the two futures is the asymmetry of the institution's assessment of the two women and the institution's management of the two women in the specific forms that the institution had available for the management. Diana was the heir's wife. The heir's wife received the 17 million. Sarah was the second son's wife. The second son's wife received the 500,000. The vulgar applied to one of them. The stone face at the breakfast table applied to both. The divorce was finalized on the 30th of May 1996. It had taken 4 years from the March 1992 separation announcement to the May 1996 finalization, 4 years of the separated but not divorced condition that the institution's management of the separation had been producing as the available condition for the two people who were separated, but whose divorce required the specific timing that the institution's management of the available timing required. The 4 years were the 4 years of the photographs, and the Balmoral breakfast, and the vulgar, and the palace expenses terminated, and the debt accelerating, and the specific condition of the Duchess of York, who was no longer functioning as the Duchess of York in the institutional sense, but who was still the Duchess of York in the legal and nominal sense, and who was therefore in the specific condition of the person who is the thing in name and not in function, and who is managing the gap between the name and the function in the form of the available management. The available management included the spending that continued in the gap between the name and the function. The spending had not stopped when the institutional provision stopped. The spending had continued in the form of the spending that the available credit and the available goodwill and the available commercial opportunities produced as the available spending when the institutional provision was no longer the provision, and the spending was the spending of the person, for whom the spending was the filling of the available space with the available filling. The settlement was £500,000. The specific figure is the figure that the available accounts of the divorce settlement have established as the settlement that the institution's lawyers and Andrew's position and the specific assessment of the Duchess of York's institutional contribution had produced as the appropriate figure, £500,000, in 1996. For the woman who had been the Duchess of York since 1986, and who had produced 2 children for the Duke of York, and who had performed the institutional function of the Duchess of York for the duration of the marriage, and who was now being assessed by the institution in the specific financial terms of the settlement that the assessment produced. The assessment produced £500,000. In the same year, in the same institution, Diana received approximately £17 million. The comparison is not the comparison of the equal circumstances. Diana had been the Princess of Wales, the heir's wife, the woman whose position in the succession's public image was the position of the future Queen Consort. Sarah had been the Duchess of York, the second son's wife, the woman whose position in the succession's public image was the position of the person who had married the person who would not be king. The comparison is also not the comparison of the equal contributions. Diana had produced the heir and the spare. Sarah had produced the daughters. The heir and the spare were the constitutional contribution of the highest available order. The daughters were the constitutional contribution of the lower available order in the specific constitutional framework of the institution that had, until the succession to the Crown Act of 2013, organized the line of succession around the male preference rather than the birth order. The comparison is the comparison of the institution's specific financial assessment of the 2 women's respective institutional contributions, and the specific financial assessment had produced £17 million for Diana and £500,000 for Sarah, and the ratio between the 2 figures was the ratio of the institution's assessment expressed in the specific language of the settlement figure. The ratio was 34-1. Sarah later described her divorce settlement as stingy. She said she was desperate for money after the divorce. She said the £500,000, the settlement that the institution's assessment had produced as the appropriate figure for the decade of the institutional service and the 2 children and the years of the Duchess of York, had not been sufficient for the maintenance of the lifestyle that the institutional service had produced as the available lifestyle. The lifestyle had been produced by the institutional service. The institutional service had ended. The lifestyle had not ended with the institutional service. The £500,000 had not bridged the gap between the ended institutional service and the continued lifestyle. She also lost the HRH. The HRH, Her Royal Highness, was the specific title whose loss the divorce produced, in the specific form that the title's loss takes when the divorce ends the membership in the institution whose membership generates the title. She retained the Duchess of York. She lost the Her Royal Highness. The Her Royal Highness was the specific institutional designation that converted the Duchess into the royal person rather than the person who is the Duchess. Without the HRH, the Duchess was the title, without the royal person's institutional designation. Diana also lost the HRH in the same year. Both women lost it in 1996. But Diana remained the Princess of Wales, the specific title whose emotional weight in the public consciousness was the weight of the woman who had been the most publicly loved person in Britain for a decade. Sarah remained the Duchess of York, the specific title whose public consciousness weight was the weight of the 26 photographs, and the toe-sucking, and the fat Fergie, and the Duchess of Pork. The HRH loss was the institutional statement of the 2 women's post-divorce institutional positions, expressed in the specific form of the title designation. Both lost the HRH. Both retained a title. The titles they retained were the specific expressions of the institution's assessment of their respective post-divorce positions in the public consciousness. She moved out of Sunninghill Park. Sunninghill Park was the South Fork house that had been the Yorks' marital home, and whose South Fork nickname had been the nickname of the house that the public had mocked, and whose mock had been the specific public reception of the house that Sarah had been involved in designing. She moved out of the house she had been involved in designing. The house was sold in 2008 for £15 million. It was purchased by a Chinese businessman who never moved in and allowed it to fall into disrepair. By 2023, it was in such a state of deterioration that it had to be demolished. The house that Sarah had designed, that the public had called South Fork, was demolished in 2023. She moved to a rented house in Sunningdale. The rented house in Sunningdale was the available accommodation after the Sunninghill Park departure. The available accommodation of the person who has the £500,000 settlement and the Duchess of York title without the HRH, and the debt that has been accumulating since the palace stopped paying the expenses, and the lifestyle that has not accommodated itself to the available resource. Andrew later moved to Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate. Sarah moved in with him. The moving in with the ex-husband in the year after the divorce is the biographical detail that the account of the cost of the photographs most consistently fails to examine with the attention the detail deserves. She divorced Andrew in May 1996. She was living with Andrew at Royal Lodge shortly thereafter. She has been living with Andrew at Royal Lodge, with the two daughters growing up and leaving, and the decades passing, since the divorce that was finalized in May 1996. She said in 2010, 14 years after the divorce, that she and Andrew had tried remarrying twice. The trying remarrying twice is the specific biographical detail that the account of the Bryan photographs and what they cost has not organized itself around in the form that the twice-tried remarriage requires to be examined. They had divorced in May 1996. They had tried remarrying twice in the subsequent years. They had not succeeded in the remarrying. They were still living together. She was still the Duchess of York, who was living with the Duke of York, who had divorced her in 1996, and whom she had tried to remarry twice. The institution received the available management of this arrangement. The institution did not officially comment on the ex-wife of the Queen's second son, living with the Queen's second son in the Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate, after the divorce, that the institution had managed in the form of the £500,000 settlement. The institution managed the arrangement in the available form of the not commenting. The not commenting was the available institutional response to the arrangement, that the not commenting was the institutional response to. What the £500,000 and the lost HRH and the Sunninghill Park departure and the Sunningdale rental and the Royal Lodge cohabitation together established was the specific financial architecture of the post-Bryan photographs Sarah Ferguson, the architecture of the person who had been the Duchess of York with the institutional provision and who was now the Duchess of York without the institutional provision and with the £500,000 that was not sufficient for the lifestyle that the institutional provision had produced as the available lifestyle. The architecture was the architecture of the debt. The debt began before the photographs. The spending had been producing the debt since the early years of the marriage. The photographs had terminated the institutional provision that had been managing the debt. The termination of the institutional provision had left the debt unmanaged. The unmanaged debt was the specific condition that the subsequent years were going to be required to manage in the available commercial forms that the available commercial forms produced for the management. The available commercial forms were the forms that the person who is the Duchess of York without the HRH and with the £500,000 and the debt has available: the books and the television and the speaking engagements and the product endorsements and the specific variety of the commercial deployment of the remaining credential of the institutional position that had been vacated. The remaining credential was the Duchess of York. The Duchess of York was the credential. The credential was the thing that the photographs had produced as the public recognition. The recognition in the specific form of the photographs, and the Balmoral breakfast, and the vulgar, and the toe-sucking, and the fat Fergie, and the Duchess of Pork. The public recognition was the specific form of the credential that the commercial deployment was organized around deploying. She became a spokesperson for Weight Watchers. The Weight Watchers was the specific commercial deployment of the credential in the available commercial form of the person whose public recognition was the public recognition of the fat Fergie and the Duchess of Pork, and who was now the spokesperson for the weight loss program. The deployment was the deployment of the public recognition in the commercial direction that the public recognition's specific character made commercially available. She wrote books. She wrote children's books. She wrote memoirs. She wrote the books that the available commercial platform of the Duchess of York's recognition produced as the available books. The books were the commercial product of the credential. The credential was the Duchess of York. The Duchess of York was the remaining institutional designation of the person who had been the institutional person and who was now the commercial deployment of the remaining designation. She wrote a book called My Story in 1996. In it, she described the institutional experience and the marriage and the separation and the photographs and the specific quality of the decade of the institutional service. The book was the first available commercial form of the memoir, the specific form of the institutional account that the person who has been inside the institution and who has left the institution produces as the available commercial product of the institutional experience. The £500,000 was not enough. It was never going to be enough. Not for the person who had the 25 cases and the coat hanger trunks and the 5 times Diana's servants and the personal trainers in the late afternoon. Not for the person whose spending was the filling of the something missing. Not for the person who had been told by the institution that her decade of the institutional service was worth 34 times less than the heir's wife's decade. The debt was going to accumulate. The commercial forms were going to be insufficient. The available management of the available insufficiency was going to produce the available management in the increasingly desperate directions that the available management of the increasingly desperate insufficiency produces. The increasingly desperate directions are the directions of the Jeffrey Epstein money and the 2010 sting and the bankruptcy advice and the breast cancer and the skin cancer and the publishers dropping the children's book. Those directions were all ahead. In 1996, all that was established was the £500,000 and the 34-to-1 ratio and the lost HRH and the Duchess of York without the HRH and the debt that was not being managed and the Royal Lodge where Andrew was living and where she was going to go. The going to go was the going. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely keeps this channel going, and I read every single comment. Drop one below telling me where in the world you are watching from. The debt did not arrive all at once. The debt accumulated in the specific form that the debt of the person whose spending is the filling of the something missing accumulates, gradually and then suddenly, and then in the form of the number that the gradual and the sudden have produced as the available number when the available number has become the number that the person managing it has identified as the number that the management has been unable to manage. The number that the management had been unable to manage was eventually £5 million. The £5 million was the figure that the Sunday Telegraph reported in 2010, the figure of the Duchess of York's accumulated debts that the reporting had established as the figure that the available management had been managing toward rather than away from across the years between the 1996 divorce settlement and the 2010 reporting. The Sunday Telegraph also reported that at least one senior financial advisor to Buckingham Palace had recommended that Sarah seek voluntary bankruptcy. The voluntary bankruptcy recommendation was the recommendation of the senior financial advisor who had assessed the £5 million figure and had concluded that the available options for the management of the £5 million figure included the voluntary bankruptcy as the least bad available option. Voluntary bankruptcy. For a member of the royal family. For the first time in the history of the British royal family, a senior Buckingham Palace financial advisor was recommending that a member of the family seek voluntary bankruptcy. The Queen was described as deeply concerned by the debts, which were more than twice as large as previously thought. More than twice as large as previously thought. The previously thought figure had been approximately £2.4 million. The actual figure was £5 million. The difference between the previously thought and the actual was the difference that the management of the debt in the available form of the not quite disclosed had produced. The figure that the people managing the debt knew was the larger figure, and that the public account of the debt had been managing in the direction of the smaller figure. The accumulation had been underway since before the photographs. The marriage had been producing the debt since the early years, the South Fork house, and the 25 cases, and the coat hanger trunks, and the 5 times Diana's servants, and the personal trainers in the late afternoon. The institutional provision had been covering the accumulation during the marriage, in the form of the institutional provision that covered it. The photographs had terminated the institutional provision. The termination had left the accumulation uncovered. The uncovered accumulation had produced the commercial ventures. The commercial ventures had been the available management of the uncovered accumulation in the form of the commercial deployment of the credential, the Duchess of York credential, deployed in the available commercial directions that the credential made commercially available. Weight Watchers was the first major commercial deployment. She became the spokesperson for Weight Watchers in 1997, the year following the divorce. The Weight Watchers spokespersonship was the commercial deployment of the Fat Fergie and the Duchess of Pork public recognition, in the specific commercial direction that the weight loss program's marketing apparatus had identified as the commercial direction that the Fat Fergie and the Duchess of Pork recognition made available. The deployment worked initially. She lost weight, the campaign ran, the public recognized the Fat Fergie in the Weight Watchers spokesperson and received the Weight Watchers spokesperson in the form that the Fat Fergie's public recognition produced. The Weight Watchers contract eventually ended. Contracts end. The ending of the Weight Watchers contract was the ending of the specific commercial revenue stream that the contract had been producing and whose ending had left the available commercial revenue streams diminished by the specific amount of the Weight Watchers contract's contribution. The books continued. She wrote children's books. She wrote the Budgie the Little Helicopter series, which had begun before the divorce and which continued after the divorce, in the specific form of the children's book series, whose continuation, the commercial market for the Budgie the Little Helicopter series, produced as the available continuation. She wrote other books, novels, memoirs, the specific variety of the book that the author whose credential is the institutional experience of the person who has been inside the British royal family produces for the commercial market that the institutional experience credential generates. The books sold. The book's earnings were consumed by the expenses. The expenses were the expenses of the person whose lifestyle had been organized around the institutional provision and whose lifestyle had not accommodated itself to the available earnings of the books in the form that the accommodation would have required. The earnings were the floor. The expenses continued toward the ceiling. The floor and the ceiling's continued divergence was the arithmetic of the debt. The speaking engagements were the specific commercial deployment of the credential in the form of the appearance. She charged approximately £65,000 per appearance for the speaking engagements, £65,000 for the person who was the Duchess of York to appear at the occasion and to speak about the subjects that the occasion required her to speak about, which were the subjects of the institutional experience and the self-improvement and the overcoming of the adversity and the road to the authentic life and the specific variety of the inspirational content that the person whose institutional experience and public humiliation had been the specific content of the preceding years produces as the available inspirational content. The £65,000 per appearance was the substantial commercial rate for the substantial commercial deployment of the substantial credential. The substantial commercial rate was not sufficient for the expenses that the lifestyle had been producing. The arithmetic of the £65,000 per appearance against the expenses of the person who arrives with 25 cases and pays £800 to £4,000 in excess baggage and requires the personal trainers and the hairdressers and the Pilates instructors to wait hundreds of pounds an hour in the late afternoon produces the arithmetic of the insufficient, the £65,000 per appearance consumed by the specific costs of the production of the appearance and the lifestyle that the production of the appearance was organized around maintaining. Hartmore LLC was the company set up to manage her American career in publishing, public speaking, and media work. The American career was the career that the American commercial market for the British royal family's institutional experience had generated as the available commercial deployment of the credential in the American market. The American market was the market that the British royal family's institutional experience credential generates as the most significant available foreign market for the credential. The American public's specific fascination with the British royal family and the British royal family's institutional experience is the fascination that the American commercial market is organized around commercially. Hartmore LLC collapsed with debts of around $1 million. The $1 million of debts was the specific collapse of the American commercial management company in the form that the commercial management company's collapse takes when the commercial management company's debts have reached the level of the collapse. The Hartmore LLC collapse was the specific available management company's collapse in the sequence of the available management's management of the available insufficiency. The available management of the available insufficiency produced, at the £5 million point, the available option of Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein was the American financier whose specific character and whose specific commercial and social world were the character and the world that the subsequent decades established in the form of the criminal prosecution and the conviction and the prison death. In the years before the criminal prosecution, in the years of the late 1990s and the early 2000s, when Epstein's social world was the social world of the wealthy and the powerful and the connected in the specific form that the wealthy and the powerful and the connected produced as the available social world, Epstein was the person in Sarah's available social world in the specific form of the financial resource. She met Epstein through Andrew. Andrew's connection to Epstein was the connection of the person whose social world overlapped with the person in the overlapping social world, in the specific way that the social worlds of the wealthy and the connected overlap. Andrew had known Epstein since at least the late 1990s. The knowing had produced the available connection. The available connection had produced the available resource in the form of the person who was willing to extend the available financial resource to the person in Sarah's available financial condition. She accepted £15,000 from Epstein. The £15,000 was the specific amount that she later admitted accepting from Epstein to pay a staff member, Johnny O'Sullivan, a former assistant, who she owed for unpaid wages and expenses. The £15,000 was the specific financial transaction between Sarah Ferguson and Jeffrey Epstein that the available record has established as the confirmed transaction whose confirmation Sarah herself had produced in the form of the admission. She said she deeply regretted having any connection with Epstein. The deeply regretting was the specific available management of the confirmed transaction in the form of the regret that the confirmed transaction required when the confirmed transaction was the transaction with the person who was later convicted of sex trafficking and who died in prison, and whose specific character and specific crimes had converted the £15,000 into the £15,000 from Jeffrey Epstein rather than the £15,000 available in the form of the financial resource. The emails that emerged in 2025 established a further dimension of the Epstein connection. The emails, photographed by Vanity Fair's Christopher Anderson in 2015 and shared publicly in 2025, showed Epstein claiming that Sarah owed him nearly £73,000 in unpaid wages for her former assistant. The £73,000 was the specific figure that Epstein's email described as the debt in the form of the claim against the person who owed the debt to the person from whom the debt was owed. Andrew was copied on the correspondence. The £73,000 figure against the £15,000 admission produces the specific picture of the Epstein financial relationship that the £15,000 admission had been managing in the direction of the insufficient picture. The £15,000 admitted transaction against the £73,000 correspondence is the picture of the financial relationship that is larger than the £15,000 admission had been organizing the available account around. The £5 million of debts, the Hartmore LLC's $1 million collapse, the £73,000 Epstein correspondence, the £15,000 admitted transaction, the voluntary bankruptcy advice from the senior Buckingham Palace financial advisor, the Weight Watchers contract ended. The speaking engagements at £65,000 per appearance, consumed by the excess baggage and the personal trainers in the late afternoon. This was the arithmetic of the desperation that the £500,000 divorce settlement and the 34-to-1 ratio had produced as the available arithmetic, not immediately, not in the form of the single collapse, in the form of the gradual and then the sudden accumulation that the management of the available insufficiency produces when the available insufficiency is the insufficiency of the person whose spending is the filling of the something missing, and whose something missing has not been filled by the available spending across the years of the accumulation. The filling continued. The something missing was not filled. The debt was the arithmetic of the unfilled something missing, expressed in the specific financial form that the unfilled something missing takes across the years of the attempting to fill it with the available commercial forms of the institutional credential that the institution had assessed at 34 times less than the heir's wife's equivalent credential. 34 times less. The arithmetic starts there. The £5 million ends there. Everything between the two numbers is the arithmetic of the something missing and the filling and the insufficient and the Epstein and the sting and the bankruptcy advice and the continued. Mazhar Mahmood had been doing this for 20 years. He was the news of the world's most celebrated undercover reporter, known universally as the fake sheikh, for the signature disguise he deployed in the specific form of the wealthy Gulf businessman whose persona he constructed for the specific purpose of the encounter with the person whose encounter the persona was constructed to produce. He had stung politicians and celebrities and criminals and fraudsters across 2 decades of the undercover operation that the news of the world had been organizing around his specific talent for the construction of the persona that the target required to be the persona they encountered. He had stung Paul Burrell. He had stung Princess Michael of Kent. He had stung members of parliament and ministers and businessmen and the specific variety of the prominent British person whose encounter with the persona of the wealthy Gulf businessman produced the account that the news of the world's commercial model was organized around producing. In May 2010, he encountered Sarah Ferguson. She was 50 years old. She had been the Duchess of York for 24 years. She had the £5 million of debt. She had the Hartmore LLC's $1 million collapse. She had the £73,000 of Epstein correspondence and the £15,000 of the confirmed Epstein transaction. She had the voluntary bankruptcy advice from the senior Buckingham Palace financial advisor. She was living with Andrew at Royal Lodge. She was receiving, by the available accounts, approximately £15,000 per month from Andrew to help cover her living expenses, the £15,000 per month from the separated husband who was paying the monthly provision for the ex-wife who was living in the Royal Lodge where the separated husband was also living. She was in the meeting with Mahmood's persona in a London hotel. The persona was the person of the wealthy businessman who was presenting himself as the representative of the South Korean interests, the specific international commercial identity that Mahmood had constructed for the specific operation. The meeting had been arranged in the form that the meetings that Mahmood's operations are arranged in, the arrangement of the introduction through the channel that produces the meeting with the target, in the form that the meeting requires to be the meeting that the operation is organized to produce. The meeting was secretly recorded. On the recording, Sarah Ferguson is audible saying, £500,000, when you can, to me, open doors. £500,000, when you can, to me, open doors. The 4-part sentence is the sentence of the person who is offering the specific thing that the 4-part sentence is offering, the £500,000 to the specific person in front of them, payable at the person's convenience, to be delivered to Sarah Ferguson, in exchange for the opening of the doors that the Sarah Ferguson can open. She was asked on the recording whether she was referring to Prince Andrew. She said, yeah, the monosyllable of the confirmation. The confirmation of the specific thing that the £500,000 and the open doors and the to me were confirming in the monosyllable. That the doors being offered for the £500,000 were the doors of the Prince Andrew, the Queen's second son, the Duke of York, the man who was living with her at Royal Lodge. She also accepted £40,000 in cash. The £40,000 was the specific sum that the recording documented as the sum accepted during the meeting as the specific partial advance on the £500,000 arrangement. The £40,000 in cash was the cash that Mahmood's persona had produced at the meeting as the partial advance, and that Sarah Ferguson had accepted as the partial advance, and that was now the £40,000 of the confirmed transaction that the news of the world's recording had documented alongside the £500,000 and the when you can, and the to me, and the open doors, and the yeah. The news of the world published the story on the 23rd of May, 2010. The story was the story that the recording had produced, the Duchess of York, secretly recorded, offering access to Prince Andrew for £500,000, accepting £40,000 in cash. The story was accompanied by the video footage that the recording's technology had produced, the visual evidence of the meeting, in the form of the footage that the visual recording of the meeting provided, as the evidence beyond the audio transcript. Andrew issued a statement. The statement said he had no knowledge of the meeting. The no knowledge was the specific available institutional statement of the person whose position the meeting was organized around accessing, and whose position required the statement of the no knowledge in the available institutional form, the statement that established the distance between the institutional position and the meeting that had been organized around the institutional position in the form of the £500,000, and the year, and the open doors. Sarah issued a statement. The statement said she was very sorry for a serious lapse in judgment. It said her financial situation was under stress. It said the financial stress was no excuse for the lapse. It said she was very deeply sorry. The very deeply sorry was the specific available management of the thing that had been recorded and published, and that the video footage had documented in the form that the video footage documents the thing that the available management is required to manage after the video footage has documented it. She said her financial situation was under stress. The understatement of the £5 million of debt, and the Hartmore LLC's $1 million collapse, and the voluntary bankruptcy advice, and the £73,000 of Epstein correspondence, and the £15,000 of the confirmed Epstein transaction, was the understatement of the person who is describing the financial stress, in the form that the financial stress of the person who is the Duchess of York requires to be described, when the description is the public statement that the public statement requires. The financial situation was under stress. The specific quality of the 2010 sting is the quality that requires the examination of the distance between the 1986 wedding and the 2010 hotel room. In 1986, Sarah Ferguson had walked up the aisle of Westminster Abbey, and the British public had approved of her in the specific form of the approval rating that was higher than the Queen's. She was the breath of fresh air. She was the person you could take down the pub. She was the red-haired, irreverent, laughing person who was marrying the Queen's second son and who appeared to find the entire occasion enormously entertaining. In 2010, she was in a London hotel room accepting £40,000 in cash from a journalist disguised as a wealthy businessman and saying yeah in confirmation that the doors she was selling for £500,000 were the doors of the son of the Queen she had just described her approval rating as exceeding. The distance between the 1986 wedding and the 2010 hotel room is the distance that the Bryan photographs and the Balmoral breakfast and the vulgar and the £500,000 settlement and the 34-to-1 ratio and the £5 million of debt and the Hartmore LLC collapse and the Epstein correspondence had produced as the distance. The distance was 24 years. The fake shake sting was not the first news of the world sting involving a royal connection. Mahmoud had stung Paul Burrell. He had stung Princess Michael. The news of the world's commercial model had been organized around the sting operation that produced the royally connected person in the hotel room with the wealthy businessman's persona and the recording and the story. The commercial model was the model. Sarah Ferguson was the latest available deployment of the model. She was also the deployment that most precisely captured the specific quality of the cost of the Bryan photographs, in the form that the cost takes when the cost is the 24 years of the accumulation that the photographs had initiated. The photographs had not caused the 2010 sting. The photographs had initiated the sequence that the 2010 sting was the 24th year expression of. The sequence of the palace expenses terminated and the £500,000 settlement and the 34-to-1 ratio and the £5 million of debt and the Epstein correspondence. The sequence had produced the 50-year-old woman in the London hotel room saying yeah, in confirmation that the doors she was selling were the doors of the man she was living with at Royal Lodge. Mahmoud had been doing this for 20 years. He had encountered the specific variety of the prominent British person in the hotel room, with the wealthy businessman's persona, many times before the Sarah Ferguson encounter. He had not previously encountered the specific variety of the person who was the ex-wife of the Queen's son, offering access to the ex-husband in the hotel room, with the persona's £40,000 in cash. She took the cash. She said yeah, she was 50 years old. The story produced the coverage that the story produced, the international coverage of the Duchess of York in the hotel room, with the cash, and the yeah, and the open doors, and the Andrew. The coverage was extensive in the specific form that the coverage of the prominent British person in the hotel room, with the fake sheikh's cash, and the yeah, is extensive in the international press. The coverage also produced a specific statement from Buckingham Palace. The palace said it was a matter that Sarah Ferguson must deal with. The palace was not going to deal with it. The palace had been dealing with Sarah Ferguson since August 20th, 1992, and the stone face at the breakfast table, and the 5 days, and the Philip forbidding, and the palace expenses terminated, and the £500,000 settlement, and the 34-to-1 ratio. The palace was done dealing with it. It was a matter that Sarah Ferguson must deal with. She dealt with it in the available forms of the deeply sorry, and the serious lapse in judgment, and the financial stress that was no excuse. The dealing was the available dealing of the person who had been dealing with the available consequences of the available management of the available insufficiency for 24 years. The dealing continued. The debt continued. The something missing continued. 24 years after August 20th, 1992, it was still continuing. Jeffrey Epstein came into Sarah Ferguson's life through Andrew. This is the specific biographical fact that the available account of the Epstein connection has established as the entry point of the connection. The connection did not arrive independently, it arrived through the man she had divorced and was living with, and who had been conducting his own relationship with Epstein since at least the late 1990s, and who had produced the introduction that the introduction required. Andrew's relationship with Epstein was the relationship of the two people whose social worlds overlapped in the specific form that the social worlds of the wealthy and the connected overlap when the wealthy and the connected are in the same available social world. Andrew was the Queen's second son and the Duke of York, and the international trade envoy, whose role was the role of the British commercial ambassador in the international commercial world. Epstein was the American financier, whose social world was the social world of the wealthy and the powerful, and the connected, in the specific form that the late 1990s and early 2000s produced as the available social world of the person whose wealth and connections made the available social world the available social world. The introduction produced the connection. The connection produced the available financial resource in the form of the person who was willing to extend the available financial resource. The available financial resource was the resource that the £5 million of debt and the Hartmore LLC's $1 million collapse and the voluntary bankruptcy advice had identified as the resource that the management of the available insufficiency required. She accepted £15,000 from Epstein. She admitted this. The admission was the admission that the available public record required in the form of the confirmation of the specific transaction that the specific transaction's existence had required the confirmation of. She said the £15,000 was to pay Johnny O'Sullivan, her former personal assistant, for the unpaid wages and expenses that she owed him. Johnny O'Sullivan was the person to whom the £15,000 was paid. The £15,000 from Epstein was the resource that covered the O'Sullivan obligation. The O'Sullivan obligation was the obligation of the person who had been running the lifestyle of the 25 cases and the coat hanger trunks and the personal trainers in the late afternoon without the sufficient resource to manage the obligations that the lifestyle produces for the people whose service the lifestyle requires. The service had been provided, the service had not been paid. The unpaid service produced the obligation produced the Epstein resource. She said she deeply regretted having any connection with Epstein. The deeply regretting was the deeply regretting of the person who had accepted the £15,000 from the person who was later convicted of sex trafficking and who had died in prison while awaiting trial on further charges, and whose specific character and whose specific crimes had converted the £15,000, £0,000, from Jeffrey Epstein in the form that the £15,000 from Jeffrey Epstein takes in the public record after the Jeffrey Epstein of the specific character and specific crimes has been established as the Jeffrey Epstein of the public record. The £15,000 was the admitted figure. The admitted figure was not the complete figure. In 2015, a journalist named Christopher Anderson photographed a series of Epstein's emails. The photographs were made while Anderson was conducting research for a Vanity Fair piece that was examining the Epstein world in the period before the full public accounting of the Epstein world had been produced by the criminal prosecution. The photographs of the emails were the photographs of the documentary record of the Epstein financial world, in the specific form that the Epstein financial world produced the documentary record of the financial transactions and the financial relationships and the financial obligations of the people who were in the Epstein financial world. The photographs were shared publicly in 2025. The specific occasion of the sharing was the occasion that the ongoing public accounting of the Epstein world had produced in the form of the continuing revelation of the emails and the documents and the specific financial relationships that the Epstein world had contained and that the continuing revelation was producing in the public record. The 2025 sharing was the sharing of the photographs that the 2015 photographing had produced in the specific form that the decades interval between the photographing and the sharing produced when the sharing was produced by the specific occasion. The emails showed Epstein claiming that Sarah Ferguson owed him nearly £73,000. The £73,000 was the specific figure that the Epstein email described as the amount owed, not the £15,000 of the admitted transaction, but the £73,000 of the email's claim. The email's claim was the claim of the person who had extended the financial resource and who was claiming the return of the financial resource in the specific form of the email's financial claim against the person to whom the resource had been extended. Andrew was copied on the correspondence. The specific biographical detail that Andrew was copied on the correspondence about the £73,000 debt that his ex-wife owed to Jeffrey Epstein is the biographical detail that the available account of the Epstein connection has established as the detail that most precisely establishes the specific character of the triangulated relationship, the ex-wife, the ex-husband, the American financier, and the £73,000 of the correspondence that the ex-husband was copied on. The emails also showed that Epstein had intervened to help Sarah restructure her debts. The restructuring was the specific available financial service that the Epstein resource had been organized around providing in the form of the debt restructuring that the person whose debts require the restructuring receives from the person whose resource makes the restructuring available. The Epstein resource had been available for the debt restructuring. The debt restructuring had been produced from the Epstein resource. The ex-husband had been copied on the correspondence. When the 2025 sharing of the 2015 photographs of the emails produced the public account of the £73,000 and the debt restructuring and the Andrew copied on correspondence, the cost to Sarah Ferguson of the Epstein connection was the cost in the form that the public account produces when the public account is the account of the £73,000 and the debt restructuring and the Andrew and the 2010 stings, and the open doors and the £40,000 in cash and the £5 million of debt and the voluntary bankruptcy advice and the something missing and the Argentina. The publishers dropped her children's book. The specific book was Flora and Fern, Kindness Along the Way, the children's book that the publisher had contracted to publish and that the 2025 revelations had produced as the book that the publisher was declining to publish in the form of the withdrawal that the publishers. Assessment of the available commercial and reputational cost of publishing the book of the author whose Epstein connection had been established in the public record at the level of the £73,000 and the debt restructuring and the Andrew copied correspondence produced as the appropriate response. The charities dropped her. The charities for which she had been a patron, the specific charitable organizations whose association with the Duchess of York had been the association of the charitable organization with the institutional credential of the person whose public recognition made the charitable association commercially and reputationally available, dropped the association in the form of the dropping that the charitable organization's assessment of the available cost of the maintained association produced when the available cost had been established at the level of the £73,000 and the Flora and Fern withdrawal, and the 2025 emails. She said she was deeply saddened by the decisions. The deeply saddened was the available response to the dropping in the specific form that the deeply saddened takes when the deeply saddened is the available response to the publisher's withdrawal and the charitable organization's dropping. The deeply saddened managed the dropping in the form that the deeply saddened manages the available cost of the thing that the deeply saddened is the response to. The former BBC royal correspondent Jenny Bond assessed the Epstein dimension with the specificity that the Epstein dimension's specific character in the context of the full biographical account required. She said, "Well, now she will have to find a new way to support herself. Her publishing deals and endorsements are over, unless, of course, she decides to sell her story." The selling of the story is the available option that Bond had identified as the option that remained after the publisher withdrawal and the charitable dropping had removed the publishing deals and the endorsements. The selling of the story is the story of Argentina, and the something missing, and the Bryan photographs, and the Balmoral breakfast, and the vulgar, and the 34-to-1 ratio, and the £5 million of debt, and the Hartmore LLC, and the Epstein £15,000, and the Epstein £73,000, and the Epstein restructuring, and the Andrew copied correspondence, and the 2010 sting, and the and the open doors, and the £40,000 in cash. The story was available. The story was the story this account has been assembling. The Epstein dimension is the dimension that the cost of the Bryan photographs took when the cost had been accumulating for 33 years and had produced the specific variety of the desperation that the 33 years of the accumulation produces. The Bryan photographs did not cause the Epstein connection. The Bryan photographs initiated the sequence that the Epstein connection was the 33rd year expression of. The sequence, palace expenses terminated, £500,000 settlement, 34-to-1 ratio, lost HRH, Sunninghill Park departure, Royal Lodge cohabitation, Weight Watchers ended, Hartmore LLC collapsed, £5 million of debt, voluntary bankruptcy advice, fake shake hotel room, open doors, £40,000 in cash, £15,000 from Epstein, £73,000 in Epstein correspondence, Andrew copied. Debt restructured, publishers withdrew, charities dropped, deeply saddened. The sequence started on August 20, 1992, at the Balmoral breakfast table. The sequence has not ended. They divorced in May 1996. She moved into Royal Lodge shortly afterward. It is now 2026. They are still there. This is the biographical fact that the account of the Bryan photographs and what they cost requires the most careful examination of, because the biographical fact is the biographical fact that the cost has produced as its most lasting visible expression. The woman who was photographed with another man's mouth at her foot in 1992 is still living, 30 years later, with the man she was separated from when the photographs were taken, in the house that belongs to the institution that punished her for the photographs with the £500,000 settlement and the 34-to-1 ratio and the vulgar. The arrangement has a name. They call it the best of exes. She has described Andrew as the best ex-husband in the world. He has described her as the best ex-wife. The best of exes is the available name for the available arrangement, the specific institutional form of the language that the two people who have organized their continued cohabitation around the available language of the best produce, when the available language is the language of the best, and the available arrangement is the continued cohabitation. The arrangement is not uncommon in the abstract. People divorce and continue to cohabit for various reasons. The children, the finances, the specific variety of the arrangement that the divorce has produced, as the available arrangement when the divorce does not produce the separation that the divorce is supposed to produce. The arrangement is common in the abstract. The arrangement is considerably less common in the specific form of the Duchess of York and the Duke of York cohabiting at the Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate for 30 years after the divorce that the institution had managed in the form of the £500,000 settlement and the 34-to-1 ratio and the lost HRH. The specificity of the form produces the specific quality of the arrangement that the best of X's language is managing in the available form that the best of X's language provides. She had tried to remarry Andrew twice. She said this in 2010, 14 years after the 1996 divorce. The trying to remarry Andrew twice is the biographical detail of the arrangement's specific character, the two attempts at the return to the formal institutional relationship that the 1996 divorce had ended, and that the two attempts at the remarrying had been unable to reconstitute in the available formal institutional form. The attempts failed. The arrangement continued in the available informal form of the cohabitation. What the cohabitation has looked like from the outside is the picture that the available accounts of the Royal Lodge arrangement have produced. The two people managing the available domestic life of the large house on the Windsor estate, with the daughters growing up, and the daughters marrying, and the grandchildren arriving, and the decades passing, and the best of X's language covering the specific quality of the arrangement, whose specific quality the best of X's language is organized around covering. Andrew's own situation has deteriorated in the specific ways that Andrew's specific situation has deteriorated across the years of the cohabitation with the ex-wife at Royal Lodge. In January 2022, the Queen stripped Andrew of his military affiliations and royal patronages, the specific institutional action that the institution produced as the response to the Virginia Giuffre civil lawsuit in the United States, in which Giuffre alleged that Andrew had sexually abused her when she was 17 years old, and that the alleged abuse had occurred through the Epstein network. Andrew denied the allegations. The denial was the specific available institutional response of the person whose position required the denial in the form of the denial. He settled the civil lawsuit with Giuffre in February 2022 for a reported sum of approximately £12 million. The settlement was not an admission of liability. The settlement was the settlement. The £12 million settlement that was not an admission of liability was the settlement that the institution received, as the institution receives the things it receives, with the management, and the no comment, and the continued management. He was stripped of the Duke of York title in all but name. He retained the Duchess of York title in all but name. Both of them retained the names of the titles whose institutional function the institution had removed from both of them in the specific form of the institutional removal that retains the name while removing the function. The names remained, the functions were gone. The stripping produced the specific situation of the Royal Lodge arrangement in the form that the 2022 stripping produced. The two people at Royal Lodge were now the two people who had both been stripped of their institutional functions in the specific forms that the stripping had taken for each of them. Andrew had been stripped by the Giuffre lawsuit and the £12 million settlement. Sarah had been stripped by the Bryan photographs and the £500,000 settlement and the 34-to-1 ratio and the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation. Both stripped. Both at Royal Lodge. Best of X's. The specific quality of the cohabitation in the years following Andrew's 2022 stripping is the quality that the available accounts have described in the terms of the two people whose institutional futures had been aligned in the direction of the not having an institutional future, and who were managing the available life of the Royal Lodge in the conditions that the aligned not having an institutional future had produced. The conditions were the conditions of the large house on the Windsor estate, and the best of X's language, and the daughters with their own lives, and the grandchildren, and the decades. The Royal Lodge itself became a point of contention. Reports emerged that King Charles III wanted Andrew to vacate Royal Lodge and move to a smaller property, Frogmore Cottage, the property that Harry and Meghan had occupied and vacated, which is the smaller property whose availability the King's specific management of the available properties had produced as the available smaller property for Andrew's specific situation. Andrew declined to vacate Royal Lodge. The declining was Andrew's specific available response to the King's specific available management of the available properties in the form of the declining to move to the smaller available property. The declining meant Sarah remained at Royal Lodge. The Royal Lodge situation was the Royal Lodge situation of the two people whose institutional futures had aligned in the direction of the not having an institutional future, and who were managing the available domestic arrangement of the not having an institutional future at the Royal Lodge that the declining to vacate had maintained as the available domestic arrangement. The institution that had assessed Sarah Ferguson's decade of the institutional service at £500,000 was now managing the situation of its discarded Duchess, cohabiting with the discarded Duke at the Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate. The management was the management that the institution produces when the institution has discarded the people, and the discarded people are still in the house on the estate. The management of the not commenting, and the continued management of the continued cohabitation. What the cohabitation tells about Sarah Ferguson is the thing that the best of X's language has been covering across the 30 years of the cohabitation. It tells that the woman who married the man who was absent for 40 days a year, and who developed the specific relationship to the available love, as the love that is elsewhere, has organized the 30 years following the divorce, around the continued proximity to the man whose love had been the love that was elsewhere. The proximity to the man whose love was elsewhere was the available form of the love for the woman whose formation had organized the love around the love that is elsewhere. The Argentina thesis, the love that is elsewhere, was the love that the 12-year-old at Dummerdown Farm had learned from the mother who went to Argentina. The learning produced the specific relationship to the love as the love that is elsewhere. The man who was away for 40 days a year was the available form of the love for the person whose love was the love that is elsewhere. The 30 years of the cohabitation with the man who had been the love that was elsewhere was the available form of the continued love for the person whose love had always been the love that is elsewhere. She has described Andrew as the only man who has ever understood her completely. The only man who has ever understood her completely is the man she divorced in 1996 and has been living with since the divorce, in the form of the best of X's cohabitation at the Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate. The understanding and the divorce and the cohabitation and the best of X's are the specific available forms of the relationship between the two people whose relationship the available forms have been managing across the 30 years since the divorce. John Bryan was not the only man. Bryan was 37 in the photographs. Bryan filed for bankruptcy in 1996. Bryan married the 22-year-old Belgian model in 2005. The Belgian model claimed Bryan had cheated on her with a woman who was blackmailing him. They divorced in 2013. Bryan lives relatively privately. He says the photographs were based on lies. He says he is from New York. He says it was kissing, not sucking. The man in the photographs is in New York. The man she divorced is at Royal Lodge. She is at Royal Lodge with the man she divorced. The cost of the photographs is 30 years of this arrangement. The arrangement is the best of X's at the Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate, with the stripped titles and the £5 million of debt, and the Epstein correspondence, and the 2010 sting, and the publisher withdrawal, and the charitable dropping, and the breast cancer, and the skin cancer, and the something missing that the Argentina had produced, and that the arrangement has not filled in the 30 years of the filling. The arrangement continues, the something missing continues, the best of X's continues. Bryan is in New York. He is not from Texas. In June 2023, Sarah Ferguson was diagnosed with breast cancer. The diagnosis was the diagnosis produced by the routine mammogram, the specific medical examination that the routine health management of the person of the available age produces as the available examination. The mammogram had been the routine. The routine had produced the diagnosis. The diagnosis was malignant melanoma in the breast, the specific medical finding of the routine that had produced the finding that the routine was organized around producing when the finding was the finding that required the treatment that the finding requires. She had a mastectomy. The mastectomy was the surgical removal of the breast in the specific form that the treatment of the malignant melanoma in the breast requires when the treatment requires the mastectomy, rather than the alternative treatments that the alternative treatments provide when the alternative treatment is available as the alternative. The mastectomy was the treatment. She underwent it. In 2024, she was diagnosed with a form of skin cancer. The skin cancer diagnosis was the second cancer diagnosis in 2 years, the second specific medical finding of the person whose medical history had produced the first finding in 2023 and was now producing the second finding in 2024. The second finding was the skin cancer. The skin cancer was identified as a malignant melanoma. the specific medical designation of the skin cancer, whose specific character the malignant melanoma designation establishes. 2 cancers in 2 years. The specific quality of the timing of the 2 cancer diagnoses in the context of the full available account of what the 30 years of the Bryan photographs cost had been producing is the quality that the honest account of the available cost requires to be examined with the attention that the timing's specific context requires. The timing was the timing of the person who was managing the 2 cancer diagnoses simultaneously with the Epstein fallout and the publisher withdrawal and the charitable dropping and the Royal Lodge situation and the Andrew stripping and the 30 years of the accumulated cost of the photographs mourning at the Balmoral breakfast table. The public response to the cancer diagnoses was the response that the public produces when the person who has been the subject of the coverage in the form of the fat Fergie and the Duchess of Pork and the toe-sucking and the fake shake and the Epstein correspondence is diagnosed with cancer. The response of the sympathy that the cancer diagnosis generates in the public, regardless of the specific character of the person whose diagnosis it is. The sympathy was real. The sympathy was the specific available sympathy of the public for the person who is the prominent person with the cancer diagnosis, in the form that the prominent person's cancer diagnosis generates in the public. It was not the sympathy that restored the 1986 approval rating. The 1986 approval rating was the approval rating that was higher than the Queen's, the specific approval of the person who had walked up the aisle of Westminster Abbey and who had been the breath of fresh air in the stuffy room. The cancer sympathy was the different sympathy, the sympathy of the person who has been the fat Fergie and who is now the person with the cancer, the specific transformation of the public's relationship to the person that the cancer diagnosis produces in the available public. The public sympathy did not restore anything that the 30 years had taken. The 30 years had taken the institutional position and the HRH and the Sunninghill Park and the palace expenses and the Sandringham Christmases and the public approval and the commercial prospects and the publishing deals and the charitable patronages. The cancer sympathy was the sympathy of the diagnosis. It was not the restoration of what the 30 years had taken. She was described by the people who saw her during the treatment period as managing the treatment with the specific quality of the person who manages the available difficulty in the available form. She continued to appear publicly. She attended events. She was photographed. The photographs in 2023 and 2024 were the photographs of the person who was managing the cancer treatment and the Epstein fallout and the Royal Lodge situation and the Andrew stripping and the best of X's cohabitation in the available form, that the person managing all of those things simultaneously manages them. The question that the honest accounting of the 30 years of the cost requires to be asked, and that the available account of the cost has consistently declined to ask in the form that the honest accounting requires, is the question of what the 30 years of the financial desperation and the institutional exclusion and the public humiliation had done to the body that the cancer diagnoses were now producing the specific findings in. This is not the question of the direct causation. The Bryan photographs did not cause the breast cancer and the skin cancer in the specific medical sense of the cause that the medical causation requires. The medical causation of cancer is the causation of the specific biological processes that the medical literature has established as the causation of cancer. The question is the broader question of what sustained pressure of the available kind does to the body over 30 years. The sustained pressure of the financial desperation and the institutional exclusion and the public humiliation and the fake shake hotel room and the Epstein correspondence and the publisher withdrawal and the charitable dropping, what the available accumulated pressure of those specific things does to the body of the person who has been managing them for 30 years. The research on the relationship between sustained psychological stress and the specific biological processes that the cancer literature has established as the processes whose disruption the cancer diagnosis represents, is the research that the available medical literature has been producing in the specific form of the findings that the stress and the cancer relationship produces. The findings are not the findings of the direct causation. The findings are the findings of the association, the specific association between the sustained psychological stress and the immune system disruption and the cellular processes whose disruption the cancer findings represent. The association is not the causation. The 30 years of the accumulated cost of the Bryan photographs did not cause the breast cancer and the skin cancer. The association between the 30 years and the two diagnoses is the association that the honest accounting of the cost produces when the cost includes the body that the 30 years were being managed in. She was 63 at the breast cancer diagnosis. She was 64 at the skin cancer diagnosis. She had been managing the cost of the photographs since she was 32, 31 years of the management. The body had been the body in which the management was conducted. The body produced the diagnoses. The specific quality of the Princess of Wales dimension of the 2023 breast cancer diagnosis period is the quality that the timing's specific context establishes as the dimension. Princess Catherine was also undergoing cancer treatment in 2023 and 2024. The specific quality of the two women, the Duchess of York and the Princess of Wales, managing cancer diagnoses in the same period, is the quality that the available account of the institutional management of the two women's health has produced in the specific form of the management that the institutional management produces. Catherine's treatment was managed in the institutional form of the announcement, and the managed communication, and the specific available institutional support of the person at the center of the institution. Sarah's treatment was managed in the available form of the person who is not at the center of the institution, the announcement and the available public account, and the managing of the treatment alongside the Epstein fallout and the publisher withdrawal and the charitable dropping without the institutional support of the center's person. The center received the institutional support. The Edge received the available management of the Edge. The Edge received the available management of the Edge. The Edge received the available management of the Edge. The Edge received the available management of the Edge. The Edge received the available management of the Edge. The stone face and the strangle and the vulgar, and the palace expenses terminated, and the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation, and the £500,000 settlement, and the 34-to-1 ratio, and the lost HRH, and the Royal Lodge cohabitation, and the debt spiral, and the Epstein connection, and the fake Sheikh hotel room, and the publisher withdrawal, and the charitable dropping. All of that from the Edge. Now the cancer, she said, in the period of the cancer treatment, that she was aware of how lucky she was that the mammogram had caught the breast cancer at the stage at which it was caught. She said the routine mammogram had produced the finding that the earlier stage of the finding produced as the available treatment option. She said she was grateful. The grateful was the available response to the finding stage in the specific form that the grateful takes when the grateful is the response to the finding stage rather than to the finding itself. She was grateful the routine had caught it. She managed the treatment. She continued appearing publicly. She was at Royal Lodge with Andrew. The Epstein emails were in the process of being disclosed. The publishers had not yet withdrawn. The charities had not yet dropped. The 2025 disclosures were ahead. She was managing the cancer and everything else in the available form of the person who manages the cancer and everything else, when the cancer and everything else are the available management. The body had been through the 31 years of the managing. The body was now producing the cancer diagnoses that the 31 years had produced the body into the condition of producing. The breast cancer, the skin cancer, the Epstein emails, the publisher withdrawal, the charitable dropping, the Royal Lodge, the Andrew stripping, the best of X's, the 31 years. The body had been accounting for all of it. The diagnoses were the body's accounting. John Bryan was not the villain of this story. This is the honest statement that the account of the photographs and the Balmoral breakfast and the 30 years of the cost requires to be made at the point in the account where the honest statement requires to be made, which is the point where the assembled evidence has produced the picture of the cost in sufficient detail that the honest assessment of Bryan's specific role in the cost can be made without the assessment being the assessment that the tabloid's vocabulary had been producing since August 20, 1992. The tabloid's vocabulary had been producing the assessment of the sinister financial advisor, the smooth operator who had maneuvered himself into the life of the vulnerable Duchess, and who had conducted the relationship in the specific form of the calculated access to the institutional proximity that the relationship with the Duchess of York provided to the person whose commercial interests the institutional proximity served. The sinister financial advisor, the Texan toe sucker, the man whose presence in the St Tropez photographs had produced the cost. This is not the accurate assessment of what Bryan was. It is the tabloid's available assessment. The available assessment and the accurate assessment are not the same assessment. The accurate assessment requires the examination of what Bryan actually was in Sarah Ferguson's life at the specific moment of the St Tropez villa in August 1992. He was 37 years old. He had come into her life through the Wyatt connection, through the overlapping social world of the international wealthy class that Steve Wyatt's presence in Sarah's available social world had generated as the available social world. He had been characterized as the financial advisor in the available institutional designation that the available institutional designation permitted without requiring the elaboration of the actual relationship that the designation was covering. The actual relationship was the relationship of the person who was paying the attention. This is the honest characterization of what John Bryan was in Sarah Ferguson's life in August 1992. The person who was paying the attention that the something missing required. Not the sinister financial advisor of the tabloid, not the entirely innocent toe kisser of Bryan's own correction. The person who was paying the attention in the specific form that the something missing required the attention to be paid. The something missing had been requiring the attention since the 12-year-old at Dummerdown Farm. The something missing had organized the love around the love that is elsewhere since the mother went to Argentina and the sister went to Australia. The something missing had married the man who was away for 40 days a year because the love that is elsewhere was the available form of the love. The something missing had found in Steve Wyatt the available attention before Bryan, and had found in Bryan the available attention after Wyatt. Bryan was the attention. He was present. He was attentive. He was in the St Tropez villa, paying the attention that the something missing required in the specific poolside form that the St Tropez villa and the Italian paparazzo on the hillside with the telephoto lens produced as the 26 photographs. He was also, by the accounts of the people who knew him in the period, a smooth operator. The smooth operator is the characterization that the people who knew him in the period have preserved as the characterization that most precisely captures the specific quality of his navigation of the available social world. The smooth operator is not the villain. The smooth operator is the person who moves through the available social world with the specific competence of the person who has identified the available movements and who is making them. Bryan was making the available movements. The available movements included the access to the Duchess of York and the St Tropez villa and the poolside photographs. What he received from the relationship before August 20th, 1992 was the access to the specific social world that the relationship with the Duchess of York generated as the available social world. The access was the access that the smooth operator's navigation of the available movements had produced. The access was also the access that the photographs terminated in the specific form that the photographs terminated in the specific form that the photographs are the 26 photographs of the St Tropez villa and the Italian paparazzo and the front page of the Daily Mirror. What the photographs cost him was the access and the reputation and the specific commercial position of the person whose reputation had been the reputation of the person who was not the Texan toe sucker. The Texan toe sucker was the tabloid's production. The Texan toe sucker had been the available public characterization of John Bryan since August 20th, 1992. The Texan toe sucker had been the 33-year companion of the person who is from New York and who says it was kissing, not sucking. He filed for bankruptcy in 1996. The bankruptcy was the specific financial collapse of the person whose commercial position in 1996 had produced the bankruptcy in the form that the commercial position produces the bankruptcy when the commercial position has reached the level of the bankruptcy. He had failed to pay tens of thousands in debt to creditors. The tens of thousands in debt to creditors was the specific financial condition that the bankruptcy was the available management of. The 1996 bankruptcy was the same year as the 1996 divorce. The financial advisor to the Duchess of York filed for bankruptcy in the same year that the Duchess of York received the £500,000 settlement. The specific irony of the financial advisor's bankruptcy in the same year as the advised party's £500,000 settlement has been established in the earlier parts of this account, as the specific irony that the available biographical detail produces when the available biographical detail is the bankruptcy and the settlement in the same year. He recovered from the bankruptcy. He moved through the subsequent years in the available professional directions that the recovery from the bankruptcy produced as the available directions. He was involved in various business ventures whose specific character the available public record has not established in the form that the detailed professional biography would establish. He operated in the available professional world of the person who has recovered from the bankruptcy and who is operating in the available professional world. He married Astrid Nuyens in 2005. Astrid Nuyens was 22 years old at the time of the marriage. Bryan was 50. The specific age gap of the marriage, the 50-year-old marrying the 22-year-old, is the available biographical detail of the marriage. Nuyens was a Belgian model and musician. She subsequently became a reality television personality in Belgium, a person whose public recognition in the Belgian public was the recognition that the reality television format produces in the available market, that the reality television format produces it in. Nuyens said, in the accounts that emerged from the marriage's dissolution, that Bryan had cheated on her with a woman who was blackmailing him. The cheating and the blackmail were the specific content of the dissolution's available accounts, the content of the marriage's ending in the form that the available accounts produce when the available accounts are the accounts of the cheating and the blackmail. She also said, "I paid him a lot of money." The "I paid him a lot of money" was the specific financial characterization of the marriage from the perspective of the person who had paid him a lot of money. They separated in 2013 and began divorce proceedings. The divorce proceedings produced the divorce. He lives relatively privately now. He appeared in the 2022 media cycle when The Crown's fifth season dramatized the scandal, and his phone rang with the friends calling. He said he did not want to be forever known as Fergie's Texan toe-sucking financial advisor. He said he was from New York. He said it was kissing. He said it was based on lies. The comparison between what the photographs cost Bryan and what the photographs cost Sarah Ferguson is the comparison that the honest accounting of the specific asymmetry of the cost requires. Bryan paid the reputation cost of the Texan toe-sucker characterization and the 33 years of the correction that the characterization has required. He paid the bankruptcy. He paid the marriage to the 22-year-old that ended with, "She said I paid him a lot of money, and he cheated with a woman who was blackmailing him." He is living relatively privately. He is saying it was kissing, not sucking. Sarah paid the Balmoral breakfast table, and the stone face, and the strangle, and the vulgar, and the palace expenses terminated, and the £500,000 settlement, and the 34-to-1 ratio, and the lost HRH, and the Sunninghill Park departure, and the Royal Lodge cohabitation, and the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation, and the £5 million of debt, and the Hartmore LLC collapse, and the voluntary bankruptcy advice, and the Epstein 15,000 doors, and the Epstein £73,000, and the Epstein debt restructuring, and the Andrew copied correspondence, and the fake Sheikh hotel room, and the and the open doors, and the £40,000 in cash, and the publisher withdrawal, and the charitable dropping, and the breast cancer, and the skin cancer. He corrects the record from relative privacy. She is at Royal Lodge with the man she divorced 30 years ago, managing the cancer recovery and the Epstein fallout, and the best of exes arrangement. The asymmetry is the asymmetry of the institution's assessment of the two parties to the same photographs. He was the American. The institution does not punish the American. The institution punishes its own, the person who was inside the institution and who had violated the institution's requirements in the form of the 26 photographs and the Balmoral breakfast table and the stone face. She was inside. She was punished. He was outside. He corrects the record. The record stands at, she paid 30 years. He paid the 33-year correction. On Christmas Day 2023, Sarah Ferguson walked from the Sandringham estate to St Mary Magdalene Church with the British royal family for the first time since 1991, 31 years. The last time she had made that walk was Christmas 1991, 8 months before the separation announcement of March 1992, and 1 year before the photographs of August 1992. She had walked with Andrew and Diana and a young Prince Harry on that Christmas morning in 1991, in the specific form of the person who was still the Duchess of York, in both the nominal and the functional sense. The Duchess of York, who was still inside the institution, in the full available sense of the inside. The walk she made on Christmas Day 2023 was the walk of the different person in the different circumstances. The person making the walk in 2023 was the person who had been outside the institution's inner circle for 31 years and who was walking back into the visual representation of the inner circle's most symbolic available occasion in the specific form that the walk from the Sandringham estate to St Mary Magdalene Church provides as the visual representation of the inner circle's Christmas gathering. She was 64 years old. She had the breast cancer diagnosis behind her, and the mastectomy behind her, and the skin cancer diagnosis ahead of her, or recently behind her, and the Epstein correspondence ahead of its 2025 full disclosure, and the Royal Lodge situation, and the Andrew stripping, and the best of exes cohabitation, and the 31 years of everything that the 31 years had been. She walked to the church. The photographs of the walk documented the specific image of Sarah Ferguson walking behind King Charles and Queen Camilla and Prince William and Princess Catherine toward the church at Sandringham for the first time in 31 years. The photographs were the photographs of the occasion. The Christmas walk documented in the specific form that the Christmas walk at Sandringham is documented every year in the photographs of the people making the walk. The occasion was the same occasion. The person making the walk for the first time in 31 years was the different dimension of the same occasion. She accepted bouquets of flowers from well-wishers. She was photographed accepting the flowers. The photographs of the flower acceptance were the photographs of the person who had returned to the occasion after 31 years, accepting the flowers from the people who had come to watch the occasion and who were offering the flowers in the specific form that the people who offer the flowers at the Royal Christmas Walk offer them. She was smiling. She was in a dark green coat and matching headband. She was accepting the flowers. Andrew was beside her. He was photographed laughing and joking with the people who had come to watch. The laughing and joking were the available engagement of the person who was managing the Christmas walk in the available form of the laughing and the joking. Both of them were there. The best of exes were at Sandringham for Christmas for the first time since 1991. The daughters were there, Beatrice and Eugenie, with their respective husbands, Eduardo Mapelli Mozzi and Jack Brooksbank. The daughters, who had been 4 years old and 2 years old in some of the St Tropez photographs, were at the Christmas walk with their own husbands. The babies in the background of the photographs that had cost their mother the 31 years were now the married women in the Christmas photographs that were documenting the return from the 31 years. The specific quality of the 2023 Sandringham Christmas, in the context of the full account of what the 31 years had cost, is the quality that requires the honest examination of what the re-invitation represented in the institutional accounting of the 31 years. The re-invitation was the invitation to the Christmas walk and the Christmas gathering at Sandringham. It was the re-invitation to the occasion whose uninvitation since 1991 had been the most symbolic available expression of the institutional exclusion that the photographs had produced. Was the re-invitation a restoration? The honest answer is that it was not a restoration. A restoration would have been the restoration of the institutional position, the HRH, the working royal function, the palace expenses, the institutional support that the position generates for the person at the center rather than the edge. The re-invitation was not any of those things. The re-invitation was the invitation to the walk. The walk and the restoration are not the same thing. The walk was the institution's management of the Sarah Ferguson situation in the available form of the invitation to the walk. The specific management of the person whose exclusion from the walk had been the management of the exclusion in the form of the uninvitation across 31 years, and whose re-inclusion in the walk was the management of the re-inclusion in the form of the re-invitation to the walk. The management had changed form. The form had changed from the uninvitation to the invitation. The management was still the management. What had changed between 1991 and 2023 to produce the change in the management's form? Several things had changed. The Queen was dead. The Queen had died in September 2022. The Queen had been the person whose management of the Sarah Ferguson situation had been the management of the stone face at the breakfast table and the 31 years of the available management in the form of the uninvitation. The Queen's death had produced the transition of the management to Charles. Charles's management of the Sarah Ferguson situation was the management of the person who was now the king and who was managing the institution's relationships in the form of the king's management rather than the Queen's management. The Queen's management of Sarah Ferguson had been the management that had produced the 31 years of the uninvitation. Charles's management had produced the 2023 invitation. The daughters had also become more central to the institutional life. Beatrice and Eugenie had grown up and married and produced children and had been conducting their own institutional lives as the daughters of the Duke of York, whose institutional function had been the function of the daughters, whose presence in the institutional life was the presence that the institution had been managing in the form of the management of the daughters without the formal working royal designation. Their presence in the institutional life had produced the specific family context in which the re-invitation of their mother was the available institutional management of the family context. Andrew's situation had also changed. The 2022 stripping of Andrew's military affiliations and patronages had produced the specific alignment of Sarah and Andrew in the form of the two people who had both been substantially stripped of their institutional functions. The alignment of the two stripped people in the same royal lodge produced the specific institutional situation of the management that required the management of both people simultaneously rather than the management of Sarah as the separate person whose management was the separate uninvitation. The re-invitation was therefore the re-invitation of the available management, the management of the family context and the daughters' institutional lives, and the Andrew alignment and the Charles transition in the form of the invitation that the available management produced as the invitation. She had said, in the tribute she produced at the Queen's death in September 2022, "I will always be grateful to her for the generosity she showed me in remaining close to me even after my divorce." The generosity of the remaining close was the generosity that the Queen's management of Sarah Ferguson had been described as, in the available public language of the tribute to the dead Queen. The remaining close was the remaining close of the stone face at the breakfast table and the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation, the generosity. The remaining close, the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation, was the remaining close. The tribute described it as generosity. The tribute is the available form of the tribute to the dead person whose management of the person who is producing the tribute has been the management of the 31 years of the uninvitation. The available form of the tribute is the generosity and the remaining close, rather than the stone face and the uninvitation. The tribute's available form is the form. She walked to St. Mary Magdalene on Christmas Day 2023. She accepted the flowers. She smiled for the photographs. She was in the dark green coat. Andrew was beside her laughing and joking. The daughters were behind them with their husbands. The morning was the Christmas morning that the re-invitation had produced as the available Christmas morning. It had taken 31 years to produce the Christmas morning. The 31 years had produced the breast cancer and the skin cancer and the Epstein correspondence and the publisher withdrawal and the charitable dropping and the royal lodge and the best of exes and the £5 million of debt, and the voluntary bankruptcy advice, and the fake shake hotel room, and the and the open doors, and the £40,000 in cash, and the £500,000 settlement, and the 34-to-1 ratio, and the lost HRH, and the vulgar, and the stone face. The re-invitation to the Christmas walk was the walk at the end of the 31 years of all of that. The walk took 20 minutes. The church service took an hour. They walked back. It had taken 31 years to get there, and an hour and 20 minutes to do it. That is the honest measurement of the re-invitation in the context of the 31 years. The accounting requires the assembly of everything that the preceding 13 parts have assembled in the form of the full accounting, rather than the part-by-part assembly that the parts have been producing as the sequential account. The full accounting is the accounting that the accumulated evidence of the 13 parts produces when the accumulated evidence is organized in the form of the ledger, the specific financial and personal and institutional ledger of the cost of the Bryan photographs and what they cost the specific people whose lives they organized around the cost. The ledger has 4 columns. The column of what Sarah Ferguson was before the photographs, the column of what the photographs cost Sarah Ferguson, the column of what the photographs cost John Bryan, the column of what the photographs cost everyone else, the institution, Andrew, the daughters, the public record of the specific event. The first column is the shortest and the most precise. Before August 20th, 1992, Sarah Ferguson was the most popular member of the British royal family. Not the most important, the most popular. The most important was the Queen. The most popular was Sarah. Her approval rating in the specific weeks following the July 1986 wedding had been higher than the Queen's. The breath of fresh air in the stuffy room, the red-haired, irreverent laughing person who made faces at photographers and cracked jokes in public and wore clothes that were too bright and who appeared to find the entire occasion of the British royal family enormously entertaining rather than enormously dignified. She was 32 years old in August 1992. She had been the Duchess of York for 6 years. She had produced 2 daughters for the Duke of York. She had performed the institutional function of the Duchess of York across 6 years of the institutional service. She had managed the Andrew absences and the 40 days a year, and the palace's constraints on her available commercial independence, and the something missing, and the debt that had been accumulating since the early years of the marriage. She had, in other words, already been paying a cost before the photographs. The cost before the photographs was the cost of the marriage's interior, the 40 days, and the something missing, and the spending, and the debt. The photographs did not initiate the cost, they accelerated it. The acceleration was the specific form that the photographs gave to the cost that had already been accumulating in the form that the marriage's interior had been producing. The second column is the longest and the most damaging. The photographs cost Sarah Ferguson the following, assembled in the specific order that the 13 parts have established as the sequential order of the cost's accumulation: the Balmoral breakfast, the stone face, the strangle, the 5 days, the servant's assessment of the strange demeanour, the Philip forbidding, and the Andrews organised circumvention, the leaving with the children, and the nanny, the palace expenses terminated, the Lord Charteris, vulgar, the 4 years of the separated but not divorced condition, the £500,000 divorce settlement, the 34-to-1 ratio against Diana's £17 million, the lost HRH, the Sunninghill Park departure, the Sunninghill Park's subsequent demolition in 2023, the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation, the Royal Lodge cohabitation with the man she divorced, the 2 failed attempts to remarry the man she divorced, the Weight Watchers and the books, and the £65,000 speaking engagements consumed by the excess baggage, the Hartmore LLC's $1 million collapse, the £5 million of accumulated debt, the voluntary bankruptcy advice from the senior Buckingham Palace financial advisor, the first time in the history of the British royal family that such advice was given, the £15,000 from Jeffrey Epstein, the £73,000 of the Epstein correspondence, the Andrew copied correspondence, the debt restructuring through Epstein, the fake Sheikh hotel room, the open doors, the £40,000 in cash, the very sorry for a serious lapse in judgment, the it was a matter Sarah Ferguson must deal with from the palace, the publishers withdrawing Flora and Fern, kindness along the way, the charities dropping the patronages, the breast cancer, the mastectomy, the skin cancer, the deeply saddened, the Sandringham Christmas walk after 31 years. This is the second column. This is what the photographs cost Sarah Ferguson. Not all of it was produced by the photographs in the specific causal sense. The breast cancer and the skin cancer are not the products of the photographs in the medical causal sense, but all of it was produced in the life of the person whose life the photographs had reorganized around the cost from August 20th, 1992, forward. The third column is the shortest and the least damaged. The photographs cost John Bryan the following: the Texan toe-sucker characterization that he has been correcting for 33 years. The reputation as the sinister financial advisor, the bankruptcy in 1996. The marriage to the 22-year-old Belgian model, who said she paid him a lot of money and who said he cheated with a woman who was blackmailing him. The 2013 divorce. The 33 years of the Public Records Association of his name with the Texan toe-sucker characterization and the St Tropez photographs. He corrects the record from relative privacy. He is from New York. It was kissing. The photographs were based on lies. The third column is the column of the person who was outside the institution. The institution does not reach the outside with the full available cost. The full available cost is the cost reserved for the person who was inside the institution and who violated the institution's requirements. Bryan was outside. He paid the outside's available cost. The outside's available cost is the fraction. The fourth column is the column of the institution, and Andrew and the daughters and the public record. The institution paid the following: the management cost of the photographs, and the Balmoral breakfast, and the vulgar, and the Philip forbidding, and the palace expenses, and the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation, 000 settlement, and the 34-to-1 ratio, and the Hartmore LLC, and the Epstein correspondence, and the fake shake hotel room, and the publisher withdrawal, and the charitable dropping, and the cancer diagnoses, and the 31-year management of the Sarah Ferguson situation in the available form of the management. The institution also received something. The institution received the management of the Sarah Ferguson situation in the form of the management that the institution prefers, the management of the inside person's violation of the institutional requirement through the mechanism of the institutional punishment that retains the person in the reduced available form rather than the formal exclusion. The reduction was the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation. The retention was the Duchess of York title without the HRH, and the Royal Lodge without the institutional support. The institution managed. The management was the institution's product. The product was the 31 years. Andrew paid the following. He paid the discomfort of the 5 days at Balmoral after the photographs. He paid the separated but not divorced condition of the 4 years between 1992 and 1996. He paid the £500,000 divorce settlement. He paid the £15,000 per month of the living expenses at Royal Lodge that the available accounts have established as the available provision for the ex-wife who was living at the Royal Lodge. He paid the 2 failed remarriage attempts. He paid the £12 million settlement in the Virginia Giuffre civil lawsuit in 2022, though this cost was the cost of his own specific situation rather than the cost of the photographs. He paid the stripping of the military affiliations and the patronages. He also did not pay the institutional protection that the institution's son receives from the institution across the years of the management of the institution's son's situation. The institutional protection was the protection that the institution extends to its own son in the specific form that the institution extends the protection in, the no comment and the management and the available support that the institutional son's position generates as the available support. Sarah did not receive the institutional protection. She received the institutional punishment. Andrew received the institutional protection alongside the management of his own specific crisis. The asymmetry is the asymmetry of the institution's assessment of the insider who violated the requirement, and the institution's son, whose violations are the violations that the institution manages through the available protection rather than the available punishment. The daughters paid the specific cost of the children in the background of the photographs, the 4-year-old and the 2-year-old who had been in the photographs and who had grown up in the specific conditions of the family, whose photographs had been the photographs of the Balmoral breakfast table and the vulgar, and the 31 years. They grew up and married and produced children and walked to Sandringham on Christmas Day 2023 with their mother behind the King and Queen. The public record paid the cost of the specific event's permanent available characterization as the toe-sucking scandal and the Texan financial advisor and the fake shake and the Epstein connection, and the 31 years of the accumulated cost in the form of the available public record of the person who had been the most popular royal in Britain in 1986, and who had become the Duchess of Pork and the Fat Fergie and the Yeah. The ledger is the ledger of the 4 columns. The ledger is what the Bryan photographs produced as the ledger, when the ledger is the full accounting rather than the part-by-part assembly. The part-by-part assembly had taken 13 parts. The full accounting takes the final part of this account. The photographs were published on August 20th, 1992. Sarah Ferguson was 32 years old. She had been the most popular member of the British royal family 6 years earlier. She had the approval ratings higher than the Queen's. She was the breath of fresh air in the stuffy room. The photographs cost her 33 years, not the photographs alone. The formation had been producing the cost since Argentina. The something missing had been organizing the love around the love that is elsewhere, since the 12-year-old at Dummerdown Farm had watched her mother fly to South America with the polo player, and had been left with her father and the Hampshire farm, and the something missing that the leaving had installed. The institution had been producing the cost since the stone face at the Balmoral breakfast table, the £500,000 settlement, the 34-to-1 ratio, the lost HRH, the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation, the voluntary bankruptcy advice. The it was a matter Sarah Ferguson must deal with from the palace that had produced the matter for her to deal with through its own management of the available punishment. She had been producing the cost through the filling. The something missing organized the filling organized the spending organized the debt organized the Epstein connection and the fake shake hotel room, and the yeah. All of the filling was the filling of the something missing. None of the filling filled it. The honest verdict on the Bryan photographs and what they cost is the honest verdict that the assembled evidence of the 14 preceding parts requires. The photographs were not the cause. The photographs were the occasion. The occasion produced the specific crystallization of the cost that the formation and the institution and the filling had already been generating in the available form of the gradual accumulation. The occasion crystallized the accumulation in the specific public form of the 26 photographs, and the Balmoral breakfast, and the stone face, and the strangle, and the vulgar. The institution received the occasion as the occasion that the management required to be managed in the most available punitive form. The most available punitive form was the £500,000 settlement, and the 34-to-1 ratio, and the lost HRH, and the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation. The institution deployed the most available punitive form. The most available punitive form was the most available management of the person who had violated the institutional requirement from the inside. The inside violation receives the inside punishment. The outside violation receives the outside's fraction of the cost. Bryan paid the fraction. Sarah paid the inside punishment. The asymmetry is the institution's specific mechanism for the management of the inside violation. The person who was inside the institution and who violated its requirements paid the institution's most available cost. The most available cost was 33 years of the accumulated management. What the honest verdict requires to say about Sarah Ferguson is the thing that the tabloid vocabulary and the institutional management and the 33 years of the available public account of the Fat Fergie and the Duchess of Pork and the toe-sucking and the fake shake and the Epstein correspondence have not produced in the form of the honest assessment. She was a woman of genuine warmth and genuine energy and genuine love for the people whose presence in her life was the presence of the people she loved. The genuine warmth was the warmth that the public had recognized as the warmth of the breath of fresh air in 1986, and that the 33 years of the available public account had been covering in the form of the cover that the available public account provides. The genuine energy was the energy of the person whose formation had organized the energy around the filling that had produced the spending and the debt and the fake shake hotel room, but that had also produced the 4,800 charitable engagements and the children's books and the Weight Watchers and the documentaries and the specific variety of the work that the energy produced across the 33 years. She loved Andrew. This is the honest statement that the 30 years of the Royal Lodge cohabitation and the 2 failed remarriage attempts and the best of X's language require to be the honest statement rather than the available institutional narrative of the divorced couple who are managing the best available arrangement of the available domestic situation. She loved Andrew. She had always loved Andrew. The loving of Andrew was the loving of the person whose love is the love that is elsewhere, the love that the 12-year-old at Dummerdown Farm had organized around the love that is elsewhere since the mother went to Argentina. She is still there, still loving Andrew, still at Royal Lodge, still the Duchess of York without the HRH, still managing the something missing with the available filling. The photographs were 33 years ago. John Bryan is in New York. He says it was kissing. He says he is from New York. He says it was based on lies. The record has him as the Texan toe sucker. He will die as the Texan toe sucker, regardless of the corrections. The corrections are the corrections of the person the tabloid made. The tabloid made him, and the tabloid holds him. The institution made Sarah Ferguson, and the institution punished her. The institution that made her in the specific form of the approval ratings higher than the Queen's, and the breath of fresh air, and the most popular royal in Britain. The institution that punished her in the specific form of the stone face, and the vulgar, and the 34-to-1 ratio, and the 31 years of the Sandringham uninvitation. The making and the punishing were done by the same institution. The institution that made her the most popular royal in Britain was the institution that assessed her decade of the institutional service at £500,000. The institution that produced the most popular royal in Britain was the institution that produced the "it was a matter Sarah Ferguson must deal with" from the same institution that had made the matter, and had made the Duchess, and had made the approval ratings, and had made the breath of fresh air. It made her, and it punished her, and it re-invited her to the Christmas walk 31 years later. The Christmas walk took 20 minutes. The 31 years took 31 years. She walked in the dark green coat. She accepted the flowers. She smiled. She was 64 years old. She had the breast cancer behind her, and the skin cancer recently. She had the Epstein correspondence ahead of its full public accounting. She had Andrew beside her laughing and joking. She had the daughters behind her with their husbands. She had the something missing that the Argentina had produced, and that the 33 years had not filled. She walked to St Mary Magdalene on Christmas Day 2023. The walk was the walk that had taken 33 years of the accumulated cost of the photographs to produce as the available walk. The photographs were still the photographs. The stone face was the Queen's face at the Balmoral breakfast table in August 1992. The Queen was dead. The stone face was in the available account of the mourning. The mourning was in the available account of the 33 years. The 33 years were in the ledger of the cost. The ledger is what the photographs produced when the photographs were the occasion, and the formation was the something missing, and the institution was the management, and the management was the punishment, and the punishment was 33 years. The Duchess of York walked to church. She accepted the flowers. It had taken everything described in this account to get her to that walk. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen right now. I think you will really enjoy them. And please do not forget to subscribe if you haven't already. It means more than you know. See you in the next one.